A cop who shot his wife 12 times while her kids slept in the next room. A criminology PhD student who applied for a police internship and committed one of the most infamous murders in America. And a 24-year veteran lieutenant who showed up to his ex-wife's house in full uniform with his service weapon and shot her down in front of her children. 3 cases. All of them knew exactly how investigations work. Let's see how that worked out for them.
Uncle, come see me.
116 is coming out.
Uncle, come see me. My wife.
Is she okay?
No.
We need to help her.
For a while, he was part of our family.
A now former Cleveland County deputy pleads not guilty in the murder of his wife.
The way this all went down is just, we were shocked. We're still in shock.
Uncle!
Stop. Breathe, man, breathe.
A man is crawling out of a back bedroom on his hands and knees. He's a 41-year-old sheriff's deputy. He has a badge in his house. He has a gun. And right now, in the doorway in front of 2 officers from another department who just kicked open the door, he is saying one word over and over. Uncle, 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 like a kid begging out of a wrestling hold on a school playground. It's 2:02 a.m. on August 30th, 2023. A neighborhood in eastern Canadian County, Oklahoma, just outside the city of Yukon. A small house near Sarah Road and Southwest 30th Street. In the master bedroom of that house, behind a door the responding officers haven't opened yet, is the body of his wife. She was a deputy too. Same uniform, same county, same office. She was shot in the head 12 times. Her 17-year-old son, by his own statement to investigators, woke up to the sound of gunshots and a man screaming. He was asleep in the next room when his mother was killed. This is the case of Vaughn Cannon, Cleveland County Sheriff's deputy, husband, and the man who, when the police finally got to his bedroom door, came out of it on his hands and knees crying, "Uncle," like he was the one who'd lost something that night. I want to walk you through this one all the way through. Because it's not just the murder, it's the part everyone misses. The part where a different woman, sitting in a courtroom a year later, would stand up and say, on the record, that this had been coming for years. If you like true crime cases where the killer is the last person you'd want showing up at your door, do me a favor and hit subscribe. New case every week. Real evidence, real trials, real consequences. It really does help. Okay? Let's go back. I want you to meet Jordan Reed Pyle first, because she was, by every account from the people who knew her, the kind of person you'd want in your foxhole. She was 40 years old when she died. She had a teenage son from a previous relationship. She came up through Oklahoma law enforcement the hard way. She started her career with the El Reno Police Department, a force covering the county seat of Canadian County, a town of about 18,000 people. From there, she moved to the Okarche Police Department, a tiny town of about 1,200, the kind of place where the whole department might have 4 or 5 officers, and everybody knows the chief's first name. The Okarche chief, Forrest Smith, later said he hired Jordan in March 2019. By June of 2021, she'd been hired on as a deputy for the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, just south of Oklahoma City. She started there as a school resource officer before moving into the patrol division. And along the way, she became an instructor for the crisis intervention team and served in the honor guard. That is not a glamorous progression. That's a small-town cop earning her stripes the slow way. Year by year, town by town, until she made it to the bigger sheriff's office at Cleveland County. The kind of career that happens because somebody actually wants the job, not because somebody fell into it. She was, by every account I've read, well-liked at every department she'd worked. Co-workers in Okarche and El Reno remembered her, after her death, as someone who didn't bring drama to a shift. She showed up. She did the calls. She wrote her reports. She was, in the language of small-town policing, a good stop, meaning the kind of officer you wanted on a traffic stop next to you because she stayed calm. Her father, a man named Rusty Pyle, would later describe her in 3 words that stuck with me. He said his daughter was, and I'm quoting him here, a bright light. That's the phrase a father uses when he's trying not to break down in front of a reporter. A bright light. Honestly, in true crime, we always race past the victim. I'm not doing that here. Jordan Pyle was not a footnote. She was a small-town cop in Oklahoma who, by everybody who worked with her, was thought of as brave and kind. The kind of officer her colleagues at the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office described, after her death, as courageous and compassionate. A woman who loved serving others. Her sheriff at the time, Chris Amison, after the killing, told a reporter something I want you to hold on to. He said on the record, "I'm so mad. I'm pissed that he killed her. To be honest with you, we are all angry and upset about this." That is not how a sheriff in 2023 normally talks about a deputy's death. That is how someone talks when they've been blindsided. I want to spend one more minute on Jordan because there's a detail in this case that almost nobody covered, and it tells you everything about who she was as a person, separate from being a cop. She had a 17-year-old son. He wasn't Vaughn Cannon's child. He was hers from before, from a previous relationship, before Vaughn was in the picture at all. By every reading of the household setup as it existed in August of 2023, Jordan was raising that boy in the same house she shared with Vaughn. She was the kind of mom who'd brought her kid into a marriage and was trying to make it work for him too. A kid who at 17 was old enough to have his own opinions about his stepfather, but young enough to still be living under that roof. That is a particular kind of pressure. Mothers in second marriages, with kids from a previous relationship, often spend a huge amount of mental energy holding the seams of the household together, making sure the new husband and the kid get along, making sure nobody's setting anybody off, making sure the home is, for the kid, still a home. And Jordan was doing all of that while also working full-time as a patrol deputy, going on calls, wearing a vest, coming home sometimes late at night to a husband who, as we are going to see, had a history. That is the woman who died on August 30th, 2023. Now I have to introduce you to her husband, because the picture that the public got after this case is, on its surface, the same boring American tragedy you've heard 100 times. Husband and wife, both cops, domestic dispute, shots fired, end of story. The headlines moved on within a day. You probably don't even remember reading about this case when it happened. And I'm telling you, if you had been paying attention to the back of the paper sections of Oklahoma News in late August of 2023, you'd have seen this and shrugged and moved on. Here's what got missed. Vaughn R. Cannon was 41 years old. He'd been hired on at the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office in March of 2021, 3 months before Jordan. They were both, at the time of the killing, patrol deputies in the same office. They wore the same uniform to the same building. They shared the same co-workers. They got married in 2019. By 2021, 2 years into the marriage, Jordan Pyle filed for divorce. I want to stop on that for a second because the timing matters. They get married in 2019. By 2021, she's filed paperwork to leave him. 2 years in, she's already at the point where she's walked into a courthouse and started the process. We do not know everything about why. The court records that survive show that the divorce was eventually dismissed in 2022, not because they reconciled in some beautiful way, but because, according to the court file, neither one of them showed up to the hearing. The judge tossed the case for non-appearance. They went back to being married, on paper, by default. There is a thing I want to point out about that paperwork because I think most people misread how those filings work. When somebody files for divorce in most American states, they pay a fee. They sit down with paperwork. They make decisions about custody, about property, about which lawyer to call. That is not a passing thought. That is a deliberate, multi-week process. By the time the document gets filed, the person filing it has usually spent months working up the nerve. Jordan Pyle, the trained law enforcement officer, the woman with a son to protect, she'd worked up the nerve, 24 months into her marriage, to formally file. That tells you what was happening inside that marriage, even in 2021. She wanted out. She'd taken the step. And then, somewhere between filing and the court date, something happened. Either she was talked out of it, or she was convinced it wasn't safe to keep going, or the practical pressures of 2 cop salaries, a shared household, a stepson, and the costs of an actual contested divorce ground her down. Or some combination of all of those. We don't know. But what we do know is that by 2022, Jordan was back in the house with Vaughn, divorce off the table. And the woman who had once tried to leave was, 2 years later, dead on the floor of their bedroom. So that's the timeline you have to keep in your head. 2019, married. 2021, she files for divorce. 2022, divorce dismissed because nobody showed up. August 2023, she is dead on her bedroom floor. Now, here is the part the news cycle skipped, because if you only read the local Oklahoma City coverage from August of 2023, you'd come away thinking this was a one-off, a heated argument that turned tragic. 2 cops, an argument late at night, a moment that got out of hand, a sad story. It wasn't a moment, it was a pattern. In December of 2024, more than a year after the killing, when Vaughn Cannon stood in front of a Canadian county judge for his sentencing hearing, his ex-wife, the woman he was married to before Jordan, took the stand. She was put under oath, and she told the judge, on the record, that during her own marriage to Vaughn Cannon, she had been abused. Pattern of abuse was the phrase. A pattern. Not a flash of anger, not a bad night. A pattern. She got emotional on the stand by the reporting from KFOR. She wasn't doing it for attention. She was doing it because she knew. She'd known, presumably, for years. She'd watched the man she'd once been married to land another wife, and another wife who was a deputy in his own department with no easy way out, and she'd watched, from a distance, what was likely happening. By the time she got to the witness stand, she was speaking for a woman who couldn't speak for herself anymore. Let me say that a different way, because I think it deserves it. Imagine being Vaughn Cannon's ex-wife in late August of 2023. You open up your local Oklahoma news. You see the headline, Cleveland County deputy charged with murder of his wife, also a deputy. You read the name, Vaughn Cannon. And in your stomach, you know. You don't need to read the article. You don't need to see the body cam. You don't need a press release. You know what that house looked like because you used to live in a version of it. You'd survived your version. Jordan didn't. And from that moment in August of 2023 until her testimony in December of 2024, 15 months, that ex-wife sat with the knowledge that the violence she'd survived had, in the end, killed somebody else. That is a particular kind of haunting. To know, in your bones, what was waiting in that house. To know that nobody had asked you about it when Cleveland County was hiring him. And after the sentencing, the elected district attorney for that part of Oklahoma, a man named Tommy Humphreys, put a sentence into his official press release that I think people should read. He said, plainly, the law enforcement investigation by Oklahoma City Police Department revealed Vaughn Cannon had a significant history of committing acts of domestic violence. Significant history, plural, not one incident, a career of it. That, when I sat down with this case, is what really got me. Because of all the institutions in America that should have been able to catch Vaughn Cannon early, you would think a sheriff's office in Oklahoma would be high on the list. He worked for them. They could see him every day. They had a badge to revoke. They had a job they could pull. And yet, by the time of the murder, Cannon was still a deputy in good standing. Patrol uniform, service weapon, police radio. His significant history of domestic violence was apparently not enough to stop the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office from putting him in a patrol car. I want to take a sidestep here because if you don't know this, and most viewers don't, Oklahoma, in studies of domestic violence rates per capita, consistently ranks at or near the top in the United States, year after year. By some measures, Oklahoma has the highest rate of women killed by men in single-victim, single-offender homicides in the entire country. That is the state Vaughn Cannon was working in. That is the state Jordan Pyle was working in. That is the cultural and legal environment that defined what was, and was not, considered a disqualifying record for a sheriff's deputy. In other words, the very state with the worst track record on domestic violence in America was the one where a man with a documented history of domestic violence was, somehow, still wearing a badge. Okay, let me bring you to the night, August 29th, 2023, a Tuesday going into Wednesday. The Cannon residence in eastern Canadian County, just outside Yukon. By all reporting, Vaughn and Jordan had been arguing earlier in the evening. The argument carried on into the late hours. At some point after midnight, the two of them were still going at it. Around 1 in the morning, by investigators' best timeline, the argument crossed whatever line they'd been dancing on. I want to set the scene for you, because the geography of this matters. The Cannon house was a normal-looking suburban home near Sarah Road and Southwest 30th Street. That part of the OKC metro is mostly subdivisions and farmland. Quiet at night, the kind of place where you can hear a dog bark 3 streets over. The house had a master bedroom. It had a second bedroom where the 17-year-old slept. It had a kitchen, a living room, the usual layout. There was no panic room. There was no special security. It was just a house. The kind of house where everything that happened that night happened within a few walls of each other. Jordan's 17-year-old son was in the house that night. He was in a bedroom of his own, asleep. He would later tell police what he heard. He heard up to 5 gunshots. He heard Vaughn Cannon screaming. That is what woke up a teenager in his own home at 1 in the morning. Gunshots, and the voice of a man he knew, screaming. When you read that paragraph back, you understand something about this case that the official press releases and the courtroom statements all sort of dance around. Jordan Pyle was not just murdered. She was murdered in front of her child, in a sense. The boy didn't see it happen, but he was in the same house, separated from his mother's killing by a wall and a hallway. He heard her last seconds. He heard them through drywall. And one detail I want to flag, because the local Oklahoma coverage mentioned it, but mostly without dwelling. The son told investigators he heard up to 5 gunshots. The autopsy and the crime scene later showed that Jordan had been shot 12 times in the head. 12. So either the boy lost count at 5, which honestly, who'd blame him, or the first 5 were closely spaced, and the remaining 7 came in a separate cluster he didn't fully hear. Either way, the number is on the record. 12 gunshots, from a man whose 17-year-old stepson was sleeping 1 room over. At 1:53 a.m., Oklahoma City police got a 911 call, reported domestic disturbance, reported gunshots. The 911 dispatcher pushed officers to the address in the 10,900 block of Southwest 30th Street. 2 squad cars rolled, lights on, sirens on, into a quiet residential neighborhood near Sarah Road. By the time they got there, were just before 2 a.m. The house was quiet. I want to walk you through the body cam from those next few minutes, because of all the strange details in this case, and there are a lot. The strangest one is what happened when the officers entered. Vaughn Cannon was not standing in the doorway with his hands up. He was not on the front lawn. He was not making any attempt to flag down the responding officers or explain what had happened. He was hiding. The officers cleared the front of the house, lights on, weapons drawn, working room by room. They got to the master bedroom area, and they found a closed door. They started talking through it. One of them, on body cam. The recording was released later by KOKH-TV. Calls through the door. "Mister, is anybody else in there?" A voice answers from the other side. "Cannon." He confirms there's somebody else in the room. He's asked, basically, whether she's all right. He says she's not. That is what he said on body cam to the cops at his own door. His wife is in the next room. She is not okay. The responding officer then says a sentence I think about a lot. He says, "We need to help her, but we can't help her unless you help us. You know how this works." You know how this works. Translation, you and I both wear this uniform. You and I have both been on the other side of this door, more than once. You know what comes next. Don't make us do this the hard way. What happens next is the part that, when the body cam went public, broke a lot of people. Cannon opens the door. He does not stand up. He does not walk out. He does not put his hands behind his head and surrender like a person. He crawls out, on his hands and knees, across the carpet of his own house, toward the responding officers. And as he crawls, he is saying one word, over and over. Uncle. In American English, uncle is what kids say in a wrestling match when they want the other kid to let go. It is the word a child uses when he's pinned down on a school playground and he doesn't want to be hurt anymore. It is, at its root, a surrender word, but a child's surrender word. It's not "I give up." It's not "I'm sorry." It's not any of the things an adult man would say. It's "uncle." A grown sheriff's deputy crawled out of a bedroom on his hands and knees saying "uncle," like he was the one losing the game, while his wife lay dead in the next room shot 12 times in the head. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Every detective and every defense attorney who has watched that body cam has wrestled with the same question. Is the uncle word a sign of a man in genuine shock, dissociated from what he just did? Or is it the conscious performance of helplessness from a man trained to know how arresting officers think? Cannon, remember, was a deputy. He knew, before that night, exactly how arresting officers are trained to evaluate suspects. He knew that a guy who comes out of a room aggressive is more likely to get hurt. He knew that a guy who comes out broken, small, harmless, on his hands and knees is, perversely, safer in those first few seconds. He'd been on the other side of that door, many times in his career. So when he crawled out saying "uncle," there is an honest reading where that was a man dissociating from horror. There is also an honest reading where that was a deputy executing exactly the right move to avoid being shot by his own colleagues. Both are possible. Neither was a courtroom defense in the end. And one of the responding officers stepped past him into the bedroom, found Jordan, found the scene, found everything she'd been through in the last hour of her life. The other officer put handcuffs on Vaughn Cannon. He was booked into the Canadian County Jail. The charge, first-degree murder. He was that morning officially terminated from the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office. The badge that had let him keep that gun in that house for that long was finally gone. Honestly, when I watched that body cam, I had to stop and rewind it. Not because of anything graphic. The actual shooting happened before the cops got there, but because of the way he came out, the crawl, the uncle word. I have, in the years of looking at these cases, never seen anything like it. He didn't look like a man who had snapped. He didn't look like a man who had lost control in a fight. He looked like a man trying to perform being broken, to perform being the victim of something, to perform a child's helplessness in front of his fellow cops. As if, somewhere in his head, the script of how this scene was supposed to go was that he would be the one we felt sorry for. That's the part of this case that stays with me, the performance. There's a phrase that gets used in police interrogation training. The idea that everybody in an extreme situation defaults to a script they have in their head. Soldiers default to the script of combat. Children default to the script of hiding. People with a history of getting in trouble default to the script of victimhood. Their first instinct, in the worst moment, is to be the one who needs to be protected from consequences. It is a script you build, over a lifetime, from every time you've gotten away with something by being small and pitiful. Vaughn Cannon, by all the available evidence, had been building that script for years. The uncle word at the bedroom door was the script firing on autopilot. The man who had probably said some version of, "I'm sorry, please don't hate me, I'll do better," to wife after wife, partner after partner for his entire adult life, finally said it to the cops in his own doorway. Okay, let me get into the investigation. Once Cannon was in custody, the Oklahoma City Police Department took the lead. This was already, by the morning of August 30th, going to be a hard case for everyone involved, because Jordan Pyle was a Cleveland County deputy and Vaughn Cannon was a Cleveland County deputy, and there was no version of this investigation where the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office could be the agency in charge of investigating one of its own, so OCPD ran it. The Cleveland County Sheriff at the time, Chris Amison, was the man who, when reporters got hold of him within hours, dropped that line I mentioned earlier. "I'm pissed that he killed her." Now I want to walk through what investigators actually found at the scene, because the official press release from the district attorney's office, when it came out months later, contains one number that takes a second to fully sit with. Officers found Jordan Cannon's body in the master bedroom. She had been shot in the head 12 times. 12. Not once. Not a struggle, not a wild gunfight, not one moment of rage that ended in a single gunshot. 12 gunshots to the head, from a service issue or personal firearm, to a woman who was a trained law enforcement officer with the same training he had. I'm not going to dwell on what that scene looked like, for the family's sake, and because YouTube doesn't need it. But I do need you to understand what that number means structurally. 12 gunshots to the head is not, by any honest reading, an accident. It is not a struggle for a gun where one shot went off. It is not a husband who lost it for 2 seconds. 12 gunshots is a long, sustained act. It is the conscious, repeated decision to fire, and to fire again, and to fire again. It is what the law in most states calls deliberate intent. I want to do some math on this because I think people don't always grasp how long 12 gunshots actually takes. A typical service weapon semi-automatic pistol can fire at roughly 2 to 3 rounds per second if you're squeezing the trigger as fast as possible. So in pure mechanics, 12 shots could be fired in about 4 to 6 seconds. That is, if a person is just dumping a magazine. But that is not what these wounds typically look like. 12 shots to the head in a domestic killing usually means the shooter paused, reloaded their aim, reacquired the target, fired again, walked closer, fired again. There were stretches of seconds, possibly tens of seconds, between bursts. Time in those seconds for the person holding the gun to think about what he was doing. Time to stop. Time to put the weapon down. He did not stop. That is why, when prosecutors filed charges, they didn't go with second-degree murder or with manslaughter or with any of the lesser options the case file would have allowed. The charge was first-degree murder. Deliberate intent. The very top of the chart. Cannon's defense story, once he was through the booking process and represented by counsel, was straightforward. He claimed he'd been drinking. He told investigators he'd had beers. He said he'd had tequila shots. He said he did not remember the shooting itself, that his memory was a blackout, that he had no idea what he had done. He was just a man with a hangover who'd woken up to a nightmare. It's a defense you see in domestic homicides more often than you'd think. I was drunk. I don't remember. Please go easy on me. 2 problems with that story. Problem 1 was the body cam. By the time the officers got to him, at 2:02 in the morning, less than an hour after the shooting, he was coherent enough to crawl, coherent enough to say, "Uncle," coherent enough to answer the officers' questions about whether his wife was okay. He was not unconscious. He was not slurring. He was, by every visible measure on the recording, aware of where he was and what he was doing. If you are too drunk to remember firing 12 gunshots, you are also too drunk to articulate that the woman in the next room is not okay. His own body cam undermined his own defense the moment it was played in court. And there's a thing about the blackout drunk defense that I want to flag, because it gets misused a lot in cases like these. Real alcohol blackouts, the kind where the person genuinely cannot retrieve a memory of what they did, are well documented in addiction medicine. They happen, but they are very specific. They do not generally produce coherent, complex behavior in the period right after the blackout episode. A person too drunk to remember a 15-second act of violence is also usually too drunk to immediately compose themselves, hide in a bedroom, and respond to police questions through a closed door. The body and the brain are not selective like that. Either you're functional or you're not. Cannon, on the body cam at 2:02 a.m., is clearly functional. He answers questions. He follows directions. He understands what's happening. That is not the behavior profile of a man who blacked out an hour ago. Problem 2 was the pattern. Because once OCPD started doing what investigators do, pulling old police reports, interviewing former family members, looking at the history of the man behind the badge, they found things. They found a previous marriage. They found an ex-wife who, when contacted, could tell them about a history of physical abuse. They found, in the district attorney's eventual words, a significant history of domestic violence reaching back years before Jordan. They found Jordan's own filing for divorce from 2021, a paper record of a wife trying to leave, and then, for whatever reasons, having that divorce dismissed because of court no-shows. This was not the story of a drunken accident on a Tuesday night. This was the story of a man with a history. The history just happened to catch up with him in the form of his second wife on the floor of his master bedroom. Honestly, when I read through the case file and the press releases, the part that hit me hardest is not even the murder itself. It's the rest of it. It's the ex-wife sitting in a courtroom in 2024 after Jordan had already been dead for over a year, finally being given a chance to say, on the record, what she'd survived. It's the way the system, Cleveland County, OCPD, the courts, only really caught up with Vaughn Cannon when his violence escalated to 12 shots. Everything that came before that, the pattern, the ex-wife's testimony, Jordan's failed divorce, was already on paper, somewhere, in some report. It just didn't add up to anyone in time to save Jordan Pyle. There's a phrase the district attorney's office used when they were laying out the case at sentencing. They called Vaughn Cannon's domestic violence history significant. That word, in a press release, sounds bureaucratic. But when you translate it, when you read it as what it actually was, it means that the warning lights on this man were red years before. They were red when he was married to his first wife. They were red when Jordan filed for divorce in 2021. They were red on the day Cleveland County hired him. They were red in the records of his own employer. And nobody, in the right position, did the one thing that would have mattered. Nobody took away the gun. I want you to picture how that night ended for Jordan's family. Because the actual moment of notification, the moment a phone rings and a voice on the other end says your daughter is dead, is the part of these cases that doesn't make it into the news. Rusty Pyle, Jordan's father, he's the man who lost his bright light at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. By every account from local Oklahoma reporting, when he found out, he reacted the way fathers in these stories always react, which is mostly through a wall of disbelief that takes weeks to come down. He's the one who, more than a year later, sat in that courtroom in El Reno, Oklahoma, on December 10th, 2024, and watched the man who killed his daughter stand up to read a prepared statement. He's the one who, when reporters asked him afterward, said the only thing a father can say after that. I think it was only just that he spends the rest of his life in prison. You know, take his freedom away from him like he took her life away from her. Take his freedom away from him like he took her life away from her. That sentences the entire case in 22 words. Let me bring you to the courtroom. After Cannon's arrest, the case did the slow walk through the Oklahoma court system that murder cases always do. He was held at the Canadian County Jail. He hired defense attorney Zachary Ramsey. He went through preliminary hearings. He, at one point, waived the right to a full preliminary hearing. In early 2024, he pleaded not guilty. A jury trial was set originally for May of 2024. That trial never happened. In September of 2024, in what is one of the more unusual moves in a case like this, Vaughn Cannon changed his plea. He walked into Canadian County District Court and entered a plea of guilty to first-degree murder, deliberate intent. That is not a plea you walk into lightly. First-degree murder in Oklahoma with deliberate intent carries one of 3 possible sentences, and one of them is the death penalty. The other 2 are life with the possibility of parole, or life without. By pleading guilty, Cannon was admitting to the full charge and putting himself at the mercy of a judge to decide which of those 3 he would get. Why he did it is a question his defense team has not fully answered. The simplest theory is that the evidence was overwhelming. The body cam, the pattern of domestic violence, the 12 gunshots, the ex-wife's coming testimony, the 17-year-old stepson in the next room. By September of 2024, the math on a trial was probably looking pretty rough. A guilty plea might have been the only path that took the death penalty off the table. It worked, in one sense. Cannon didn't get the needle. The sentencing hearing was December 10th, 2024. Canadian County District Court. The presiding judge was District Judge Paul Hesse. The lead prosecutor was Assistant District Attorney Austin Murray, supported by the elected DA, Tommy Humphreys. The courtroom was packed. Jordan Pyle's family and friends filled the gallery on her side. Many of them wore small homemade pins to honor her, handmade, by the people who loved her, the kind of detail you only do when grief has gone on long enough that you need to do something with your hands. Cannon's family was there too. Sheriffs and deputies from both Cleveland and Canadian counties were there, in uniform. This was, for Oklahoma law enforcement, a moment that hurt on both sides. The prosecution called their witnesses for the sentencing. The first was an investigator from the Oklahoma City Police Department who walked the court through the night of August 30th. The call, the response, the scene, the body cam. The state played the body cam in open court. According to reporters who were there, Vaughn Cannon, sitting at the defense table, kept his head down, covering his ears. He could not watch his own arrest. He could not listen to himself crawl out of that bedroom saying, "Uncle." Whatever shame he had managed to bury through the months of pre-trial proceedings, the body cam dragged it back into the light. Then the ex-wife took the stand. She is the unsung part of this story. She did not have to come. She did not have to put herself through that. Cannon was already pleading guilty. He was already going to prison. Her testimony, technically, was not what was sealing the case. The case was already sealed. What she was doing, in that witness chair, was giving Jordan's family the answer to the question that had probably been eating at them for 15 months. Was there a pattern? Was there a sign? Could anyone have known? She told the judge on the record that during her own marriage to Vaughn Cannon, she had been abused. Repeatedly. She became emotional. She described what she had endured. She corroborated what the OCPD investigation had already pieced together, that Vaughn Cannon was, in his core, a man with a history of using his fists on the women he was married to, and that history did not start with Jordan. Jordan was the end of a long line. Then, before the judge handed down a sentence, Vaughn Cannon himself took the stand. He had a prepared statement. According to reporters in the room, and to the local Oklahoma coverage from News 9, from KFOR, from the Yukon Progress, Cannon was emotional. He was, at times, sobbing. He read his statement out loud. He spoke about grief. He said, in his own words, "Grief is brutal." He spoke about failure. He said in his own words, "I especially failed my beloved wife, Jordan." He talked about feeling tortured. He talked about wishing he could take Jordan's place. He asked the families, both his own and the Piles, for forgiveness. It's a hard moment to read. Because on one hand, yes, the man is in front of a judge who's about to decide whether he sees daylight again. Of course he's saying he's sorry. Of course he's emotional. That's what people do at sentencing. They perform. They cry. They ask for forgiveness. But look at the actual content of what he said. He said he failed her. He said grief is brutal. He talked about his own grief, not hers. Not the 17-year-old in the next room. His grief. The grief of the man who shot his wife 12 times in the head and crawled out of a bedroom on his hands and knees saying, "Uncle." There is something about that statement, the way he framed himself as the bereaved, as the one suffering, that tells you who Vaughn Cannon actually is. He is, even after the guilty plea, even after the body cam, even after the ex-wife's testimony, even at the moment of his own sentencing, still casting himself as the central wound in the story. He failed her. He is tortured. He is lost. Look at what's missing in that sentence. The woman he killed is barely in it. That, more than anything, was the picture of him the courtroom got. There's a phrase a prosecutor I once heard speaking on a domestic violence panel called ownership through grief. It is the trick where an abuser, even after the abuse is over, even after the victim is gone, claims emotional ownership of the loss. They become the chief mourner. They are the most devastated person in the room. They want to be held by the same community that should be holding the victim. It is the final move in a long game of taking up space the victim should have taken up. Vaughn Cannon's sentencing statement was that move in front of a judge. The grief was his. The asking for forgiveness was his. Even the failure was his. Not Jordan's loss of her life, but his failure as a husband, framed as the central tragedy of the case. The judge, by all reports, was not buying it. Assistant District Attorney Austin Murray did his closing. He asked the judge for life without the possibility of parole. He laid out the pattern. He laid out the body cam. He laid out the ex-wife. He laid out the 12 gunshots. District Judge Paul Hesse made his ruling. Life. Without parole. He'll die in a cell. Cannon would, in the immediate aftermath, write a handwritten letter from jail asking to withdraw his guilty plea. The letter was dated December 17, 2024, 1 week after the sentencing. In it, he claimed his plea had been entered without deliberation and that he'd received ineffective assistance of counsel. A formal amended application was filed on December 27th. He was asking, in essence, for a do-over, for the right to take his case to trial after all. In January of 2025, he changed his mind. The motion was withdrawn. The sentence stands. Vaughn Cannon, as of right now, is in Oklahoma Department of Corrections custody, doing life without parole for the murder of his wife. There are a couple of small details I want to leave you with, because they are the part of this case that has stayed with me the most. The first one is the 17-year-old. Jordan Pyle's son, the boy who was in the next room, the boy who told investigators, in his initial statement, that he heard up to 5 gunshots and Vaughn Cannon screaming. We don't know, because thank God the press has not pushed on this, what that night looked like for him in the hours after. What it was like for him to wake up, hear those sounds, find out, somehow, what they meant. To lose his mother in a way no kid should lose anything. To know that the man who killed her was also, in some hideous way, the closest thing he'd had to a stepfather for the last 4 years. If you have ever watched a kid try to process the death of a parent, you know it doesn't happen quickly. It happens in pieces. It happens in the wrong moments. At school, in the car, at a graduation a year later. It will happen to this boy for the rest of his life. Every birthday he has from here on, Jordan won't be at. Every milestone she would have shown up for, she won't. The man who took those moments away from him got life without parole, but the loss is permanent in a way no sentence can balance. The second detail is the gun, because the thing nobody really talks about, Vaughn Cannon's gun, the firearm he used, was either his Cleveland County service weapon or a firearm he was legally permitted to possess because he was a deputy. Either way, that gun was in that house because the institution he worked for had decided he was safe to carry one. Because nobody, in his chain of command, looked at the records, talked to his ex-wife, pulled the file, asked the question. The system that should have stripped him of his ability to be armed was the same system that had hired him, kept hiring him, kept arming him. Jordan, until the moment her own husband turned that gun on her, would have presumably believed that her department's hiring process meant something, that her own department had done its homework, that if the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office had Vaughn on staff in a patrol car, then he must, by definition, be a person they had checked out. He wasn't. They hadn't. Honestly, when I think about this case, the part that gets me is how recognizable the pattern is. If you've watched a lot of these cases, and obviously, on this channel we have, you start to notice that the deputies and detectives and officers who kill their spouses almost always have the same backstory. Quiet history of domestic incidents that never got prosecuted. Previous partners who left them and didn't talk about why. Department hiring processes that, at best, asked a previous employer any problems, got told no, and moved on. Internal affairs files that, where they exist, contain warning signs nobody escalated. There is a kind of officer, usually a man, almost always with a history of controlling behavior, who, if you let him keep a badge and a gun long enough, will eventually use that gun on the person closest to him. The Cleveland County Sheriff's Office hired Vaughn Cannon in March of 2021. Whatever background check they ran on him was, in retrospect, not the one that would have flagged what his ex-wife had survived. We do not know how thorough that check actually was. We do not know whether anybody at Cleveland County phoned the ex-wife and asked. We do not know whether the prior departments where he might have worked, and there is, as of this writing, very little public information about Vaughn Cannon's career before Cleveland County, had any internal flags they should have shared. What we do know is that by March of 2021, he was sworn in. By June of 2021, his second wife was working alongside him. By August of 2023, his second wife was dead. The third detail, and the one I keep coming back to, is the uncle word itself. I have been thinking, since I started writing this case up, about what it means that a grown man, a sheriff's deputy with years on the job, trained to handle the worst moments of other people's lives, crawled out of his own bedroom on his hands and knees, saying a kid's surrender word in the minutes after he had murdered his wife. It is not the move of a man who has been broken by what he just did. It is not, by any reading, an honest expression of remorse. It is theater. It is performance. It is a man who, somewhere in his head, has decided that the way he's going to survive what just happened is by being the small, scared, broken thing in the room. By being the one we feel sorry for. By being the one who needs someone to step in and stop the wrestling match. The actual wrestling match, the one where he held the weapon and used it on a person, had ended about an hour earlier, with Jordan on the floor of their bedroom. He never said uncle to her. He saved that word for the men in uniform who he knew would come. The fourth detail, which I almost left out of this video, is the way the Pyle family showed up at sentencing. They wore homemade pins. Friends had made them by hand. Small, simple pins to honor Jordan. That is what you do in a small Oklahoma town when somebody you love has been killed and the system is too slow to give you a proper goodbye for a year and a half. You sit, you make pins, you wear them to court, you hope the judge sees them. Rusty Pyle, when he stood up to give his victim impact statement, was speaking on behalf of every person wearing one of those pins that morning. He was speaking for an entire community that had lost a small-town cop. He was speaking at the end for a boy who had heard gunshots through drywall. He spoke. The judge listened. And then Judge Paul Hesse gave Vaughn Cannon the maximum sentence the law in Oklahoma permitted. There is a moral, somewhere in this case, about how the system that hired Vaughn Cannon failed Jordan Pyle long before he ever pulled that trigger. About how Oklahoma's domestic violence numbers are not an accident. They are the predictable result of a culture that has, for a long time, treated officer-involved DV cases as too sensitive to fully prosecute. About how the ex-wife who finally came forward in 2024 did the thing the system had failed to do, she said out loud in a courtroom, that this had been coming. But morals are for sermons. The facts are these. Vaughn R. Cannon will spend the rest of his life in Oklahoma Department of Corrections custody. He will die there. He will have no parole, no early release, no second chance. The state of Oklahoma has decided, with the December 10th, 2024 ruling, that he is too dangerous to ever be a free man again. Jordan Reed Pyle, his second wife, was 40 years old. She had a son. She had a father. She had a department full of colleagues. She had a life she had built, town by town, year by year, from El Reno to Okarche to Cleveland County. None of that life continued past 1 a.m. on August 30th, 2023. So let me ask you what I've been asking myself. The defense's argument at every stage of this case was that Vaughn Cannon was a man broken by alcohol that night, a man who didn't remember what he had done, a man whose grief at the sentencing, sobbing on the stand about how he had failed his wife, was real. That side of the case is in the record too. People who knew him from before the murder will tell you he was, at least to them, a normal co-worker, a normal deputy, maybe even a friend. Cannon's defense attorney, Zachary Ramsey, took on a hard case and did the best he could with the cards he was dealt. That is what defense attorneys do, and it's worth remembering that even in cases like this, every defendant deserves competent representation. I'm not picking on Ramsey. He had a client who'd already confessed in front of body cameras and was facing a courtroom of police-uniformed mourners. There was no winning version of that case for the defense. The prosecution's case, on the other hand, was that Cannon was something else entirely. That his behavior on August 30th, 2023, was not a break. It was a continuation. That the significant history of domestic violence the OCPD investigation uncovered was the real Vaughn Cannon. That the uncle word and the crawl and the tears at sentencing were the act of a man who had spent his whole life knowing how to perform victimhood while doing harm. That Jordan was not a tragic accident, but the predictable end of a long pattern. 12 gunshots to the head was the line that finally caught him. When you put it side by side, the prosecution's reading is the one the body cam keeps backing up. The man who crawled out of that bedroom was not a man devastated. He was a man calculating. He was a man who had, even in the immediate aftermath of killing his wife, the presence of mind to pick the safest possible posture for himself with the responding officers. That is not the body language of grief. That is the body language of survival in a man who has spent years learning how to survive being held accountable. What do you think? Was Vaughn Cannon a man broken by one bad night? Or a man whose pattern of violence had been telegraphing this exact night for years, and nobody in the system that gave him his badge was watching closely enough to stop it? And if you've watched the body cam, and I know some of you have, what do you make of the uncle word? Was it real shock, or was it the most coldly calculated move a man can make in the worst moment of his life? I genuinely want to know what you saw in those frames. Different viewers see different things. Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. That was a cop who used the badge to hide what he was doing at home. But the next case is on another level. This guy wasn't even a cop. He was studying to become one. PhD in criminology. Teaching assistant. He literally researched how killers avoid getting caught, and then he went and did it anyway. The detail that got him is almost embarrassing.
One of the roommates has passed out, and she was drunk last night and she's not waking up.
Okay.
Oh, and they saw some man in their house last night. She's not so what's wrong? She's not waking up.
Is she breathing?
No. Did you on or about that same date in Moscow, Idaho, kill and murder Kaylee Gonzalez, a human being?
Yes.
And did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and malice aforethought?
Go to hell.
A masked man is standing in a hallway in the middle of the night. He is dressed entirely in black. He has bushy eyebrows. He has just walked past a 20-year-old woman in her own house on the second floor of a rental near the University of Idaho. She is standing in her own bedroom doorway. Their eyes meet for what is, by her later count, somewhere between 3 and 5 seconds. He walks past her, out of the house, through the sliding glass door at the back, into the dark. She does not call 911. She closes her bedroom door, locks it, gets back into her bed, and texts her other roommate downstairs that there is somebody in the house. She is terrified. She is also 19 years old, drunk from a Saturday night out, and she is not yet sure if what she just saw was real or a dream. She and her downstairs roommate spend the next 45 minutes texting each other in panic, trying to reach the 4 people upstairs who are not answering their phones. No, it will be 8 hours before either of them calls the police. By the time they do, by the time officers in the small college town of Moscow, Idaho, walk through the front door of the house at 1122 King Road on Sunday, November 13th, 2022, around noon, 4 of their friends will be dead in their beds. 3 young women, 1 young man, stabbed in the upstairs bedrooms while the rest of the city slept. The man in the black mask, by the time the bodies are found, is already back home, 8 miles across the state line in Pullman, Washington. He is taking a shower. He is washing his car. He is scrolling through his phone. In a few hours, he will go for a drive in a white Hyundai Elantra. 6 weeks from now, he will be in handcuffs at his parents' house in Pennsylvania, 3,000 miles away. He will be 28 years old. He will be a doctoral student in criminology. The thing he had been studying, for his PhD at Washington State University 10 miles from the murder scene, was how investigators catch criminals. This is the case of Brayan Khonengber, and of all the cases I have looked at this year, this is the one where the killer thought with absolute certainty that he was smarter than the people coming for him. He was wrong. If you like true crime cases where the killer leaves a trail he never thinks anyone will follow, hit subscribe right now. New case every week. Real evidence, real trials, real consequences. Stick with me on this one, because the details, when you put them in order, are wild. Let's go back. The town of Moscow, Idaho, has about 25,000 people in it. It sits on the western edge of the state, on a low plateau called the Palouse, in a region that is mostly wheat fields and rolling hills. The University of Idaho is the main employer, The college campus and the small downtown more or less blend into each other. Bars on one street, sorority houses on another, off-campus rentals filling in the rest. The last time Moscow had a murder, before November of 2022, was 2015, 7 years earlier. People in town did not lock their back doors. The college kids walked home alone at night. The whole place ran on the assumption that nothing like that ever happened there. So when you are picturing the night of November 12th, 2022, picture a Saturday night in a college town the size of a high school. 6 bars, a handful of late-night food trucks, Greek houses lit up with parties, students walking in groups from one place to the next. That is the world. And on that Saturday night, 6 people who lived together in a 3-story rental on the east side of King Road were spread out across the town, doing different versions of the same thing. Going out. The house at 1122 King Road was the kind of off-campus place you only see in college towns. 3 stories, 6 bedrooms, built into a slope, so the back of the house was higher than the front. The 3rd floor had 2 bedrooms, one belonging to a 21-year-old senior named Kaylee Goncalves, and the other belonging to her best friend Madison Mogan, also 21. The 2nd floor had 2 more bedrooms, one shared by 20-year-old Zana Kernodle and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin, the other belonging to a roommate I'm going to call Dylan, who survived. The 1st floor had a single bedroom, belonging to another surviving roommate I'm going to call Bethany, in the front door. I want you to picture the geography of that house because it is going to matter in about 20 minutes. 3rd floor on top, 2 best friends side by side. 2nd floor, a couple in one room, a girl alone in another. 1st floor, 1 girl in a room by the front door. That is the layout. Let me tell you just for a second who these people actually were, because in this case, more than in almost any other I have covered, the victims have been almost flattened by the fame of the man who killed them. And they deserve more than that. Kaylee Goncalves was 21, from a small town in northern Idaho called Rathdrum. By the people who loved her, and there were a lot of them, she was, almost from the day she walked into a room, the loudest one in it. The kind of person who organized the trip, who texted you first, who in her own family was the protector. Her younger sister, Aubrey, would later describe her in a victim impact statement as someone with a brilliance that lit up every room she walked into. Madison Mogan, Maddie, was Kaylee's best friend since middle school. The 2 of them had grown up together, gone to the same high school, picked the same college, ended up sharing the same off-campus house. They had even, by the family's later telling, made plans to be roommates again after college. They were the kind of best friends who lived inside each other's lives. On the day before the murder, Kaylee posted a picture on Instagram of all 6 housemates plus Ethan hanging out on a front porch. Maddie was on Kaylee's shoulders, both of them laughing. It was the last photograph of either of them. Zana Kernodle was 20, sophomore, from Avondale, Arizona originally, working as a server at a local pizza place in Moscow, the kind of person, by every friend's account, who was funny in a sharp, surprising way. She was dating Ethan Chapin, also 20, also a sophomore, who was visiting from his own apartment that weekend. Ethan was a triplet. His brother Hunter and sister Maisie were also students at U of I. They had grown up in Mount Vernon, Washington. All 3 of them headed off to the same college together. Ethan, by every account, was the kind of boy whose smile was the first thing you noticed about him. I want to spend one more moment on the 4 of them because the case has a way of making them blur into a category, the Idaho 4, and the truth is that they were 4 very different kids. Kaylee was, by her family's account, the planner, the big personality friend who had a 5-year plan for her career, who had already lined up a job in Texas after graduation, who had been telling her mother for weeks that she was going to move out of Idaho and start her real life. Maddie was the quieter one, the marketing major, the girl who, by her friends' accounts, did not love the spotlight and was happy to be in Kaylee's shadow when they went out. They had been best friends since the 6th grade. They wore matching outfits to Kaylee's birthday party that year. They took matching photos for Instagram. Zana, by her sister Jasmine's accounts, was the funny one, the one who made jokes at parties, the one who, when somebody at the table was sad, would do something dumb to make them laugh. She had a job at the local Mad Greek pizza restaurant in Moscow. She was studying marketing like Maddie. She had, in the months before her death, been dating Ethan for a little under a year. They were, by all their friends' accounts, a couple that was actually going somewhere. Ethan, by his triplet siblings' accounts, was the easy one. The middle child of 3 siblings who had all enrolled at U of I together. By all his friends' accounts, the kind of guy who could walk into a room and make everybody in it feel like he was their friend. He was studying recreation, sport, and tourism management. He wanted to work for a ski resort eventually. He had spent the night at the King Road house that Saturday. By all family accounts, it was actually a rare overnight, because Ethan normally went home to his own apartment with Zana. He had stayed that night because he and Zana had been at the Sigma Chi formal and then a frat party afterwards. 4 kids. Different friend groups, different majors, different paths. Joined by the simple fact of who was in which bedroom of one rental house on one Saturday night. That Saturday night, November 12th, Kaylee and Maddie went downtown to a sports bar called the Corner Club. They stayed until close. Around 1:40 in the morning on their way home, they stopped at a food truck called Grub Truckers and ordered carbonara pasta. There is video of them standing at the truck, laughing, on a live stream the food truck had running. It is one of the last public images of either of them. They got home around 1:45 a.m. Zana and Ethan were at a Sigma Chi fraternity party that night. They came back to the house around 1:45 a.m., about the same time as Kaylee and Maddie. By 2 in the morning, everybody is home. 6 people, 3 floors, beers in the fridge, phones plugged in. Across town, 8 miles away in Pullman, Washington, on the other side of the state line, a 28-year-old PhD student named Brayan Khonengber was getting in his car. I want you to meet Brayan Khonengber because his backstory is one of the strangest in modern American true crime. He had been born in 1994 in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, a small town in the Poconos. He had grown up in a working-class family. His father was an entrepreneur. His mother was a paraprofessional at a school. He had 2 older sisters, Melissa and Amanda. By every account from his hometown, his childhood was difficult, not because of his family, but because of him. He had been, by his own later admissions and the recollections of his classmates, severely overweight as a kid. He had been bullied. He had been depressed. He had also, by the time he was in high school, started using heroin. This is documented. Khonengber himself, in a forum post on the website Tappa Talk that journalists tracked down after his arrest, wrote about it. He described his own addiction. He described what he called his visual snow, a neurological condition he claimed he had, and how it made him feel disconnected from reality. He described, in his own words, feeling as though he was watching the world from behind a sheet of plastic. By 2017 or so, by all accounts, he had gotten clean. He had also dropped about 100 pounds. The kid who had been overweight and bullied and addicted in the Poconos was, by his early 20s, lean, sharp-featured, intense-looking. He had reinvented himself, and the thing he had decided to reinvent himself as was a criminologist. I want to spend a minute on that transformation because in retrospect, the people who knew Khonengber in his hometown have all said the same thing. The new version of him, the lean, intellectual, criminology-obsessed Brayan, was not, by their account, the kind person who showed up as a result of getting clean. They have described, in interviews with CBS News and others, a person who came out of his addiction harder, colder, more arrogant than the kid they remembered before. One of his former high school classmates, in an interview, said Khonengber had become someone who looked down on people, who lectured them, who needed to be the smartest person in any room. A friend from his MMA days, Khonengber had trained at a local gym for a while in his early 20s, said Khonengber had been intense in the gym, the kind of person who wanted to fight to win, not to learn. That kind of transformation in psychological literature is well documented. Sometimes a person who has been bullied and degraded for years, when they finally rebuild themselves, does not rebuild as a kinder version. They rebuild as a person who is determined never to be the bullied one again. They rebuild, in some cases, as the bully, or the predator. Whether that is what happened with Khonengber is something his defense team has not addressed and likely never will. He went to Northampton Community College, associate's degree in psychology, transferred to DeSales University in Center Valley, Pennsylvania, bachelor's in psychology, 2020, master's in criminal justice, 2022. The whole time he was studying, pretty obsessively, by his own description in academic papers and online posts, the minds of criminals, how they think, how they plan, how they get caught. As a graduate student at DeSales, he had once posted an online survey, university approved, asking ex-convicts about their crimes. One of the questions asked respondents to describe their, and these are the words on the actual survey which has been preserved in news coverage, thoughts, emotions, and actions from the beginning to the end of the crime commission process. Look at that question for a second. He was asking, of strangers who had committed crimes, the most important question a profiler can ask. What were you feeling? What were you thinking? What did the moment feel like? He was, in his academic life, building a model, in his own mind, of how the criminal mind operates. The framing of the survey, if you read it now in retrospect, is the framing of a person who is curious about a specific question, not in an abstract academic way, in a personal way. His professors at DeSales had been, by their public statements, impressed with him. They considered him a serious student. He was, by his master's program advisor's account, one of the most academically focused students they had had in years. His advisor at DeSales was Dr. Catherine Ramsland, one of the leading academic experts in serial killer behavior in the United States, known for having co-authored a book with the BTK killer Dennis Rader after years of correspondence with him in prison. Khonengber had taken her classes. He had read her books on his own time. By 2022, when he was applying to PhD programs, Ramsland was his thesis advisor and reference. She would later tell News Nation after his arrest that she saw no red flags in him, that he had been polite, respectful, intense, and curious. She would also say painfully that she wondered if her own classes, the ones on antisocial behavior, serial killer psychology, the mind of a murderer, had inspired him in some way she had not anticipated. He ended up at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, 8 miles from the University of Idaho campus. He moved across the country in the summer of 2022. He was 27 years old. He had a small apartment in Pullman. He started his first semester as a doctoral student and teaching assistant. By all accounts from people who knew him at WSU, he was, and I am borrowing the words of his fellow grad students on the record to the New York Times and the Independent, strange. One classmate, B.K. Norton, said he sort of creeped people out. Another, Benjamin Roberts, who was in 4 classes with him, said Khonengber was always trying to talk in the most complicated, perhaps academic way possible, trying to impress people, trying to seem smarter than everybody else in the room. By that fall, faculty members had filed behavioral complaints. He was clashing with students. He was clashing with female professors in particular. A dean had pulled him in for a meeting. He was, by November of 2022, on the verge of losing his teaching assistant position. That is the man who got in his car the night of November 12, 2022. He drove a 2015 Hyundai Elantra. White. He had bought it used. By the records investigators would later put together, his phone, by the count of the police affidavit, had been traced to the area of 1122 King Road late at night, on at least 12 separate occasions in the months before the murders. 12. All of them, by the affidavit's specific wording, occurred in the late evening and early morning hours of their respective days. He had also been pulled over twice in the months before the killings by Latah County Sheriff's deputies while driving in the general area. Once in August, once in October. He had been physically near that house, in that car, repeatedly. He had been watching the house. What investigators have never publicly answered, what the family of the victim still does not have a clean answer to, 3 years later, is why. Why that house? Why those people? There has been speculation that he had once seen Maddie or Zana waiting tables at the local pizza place where Zana worked. There has been speculation that he had followed someone home from a bar. The prosecutors at the eventual guilty plea said this. Latah County Prosecutor Bill Thompson stood in court and said, plainly, that Khonengber had likely not gone there planning to kill all 4 of them. He had encountered Zana Kernodle by accident, mid-attack, and her presence had altered his plan. But why he was there at all, why that house, those people, Thompson would not say. He said the prosecution did not, at the time of the plea, have a definitive motive. 3 years of investigation, tens of thousands of pages of evidence, and the answer to why is still officially blank. Let me bring you to 4 in the morning. At 4 a.m., Zana Kernodle's phone records show her ordering DoorDash, a late-night snack. She is still up on the 2nd floor of the house. By 4:12 a.m., her phone shows her active on TikTok, So at the moment the killer is approaching the house, Zana, on the second floor, is awake, on her phone. At 4:04 a.m., a white Hyundai Elantra is captured on a neighbor's surveillance camera near 1122 King Road. By the timeline investigators put together, this is the moment Khonengber arrives. He parks. He approaches the house from the rear, the side opposite King Road. The geography matters here because the rear of the house, due to the slope, is on the second floor. There is a sliding glass door at the back of the kitchen on the second floor level. By the prosecution's reconstruction at the eventual plea hearing, that sliding door was, that night, unlocked. He walks in. Sometime between 4 and 4:20 a.m., Dylan, the surviving roommate on the second floor, wakes up. She hears noises upstairs. By her statement to police, she initially thinks Kaylee is playing with her dog on the third floor. Then she hears something else. Crying. By her later account, she hears Zana crying. On the second floor, she hears a male voice say, and the exact words have been disputed across her statements, something like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She opens her bedroom door. She sees a man. By her statements to investigators, the man is dressed entirely in black. He is wearing a mask covering the lower half of his face. He is tall and thin. He has, in her words, bushy eyebrows. He is walking toward the back of the house, toward the sliding glass door. He walks past her room. He does not stop. He does not turn. He does not say anything to her. She closes her bedroom door, locks it, and gets into her bed. Honestly, that detail, the simple fact of what Dylan did, is the one I cannot stop thinking about in this whole case. A 20-year-old college student who has just heard her best friends being attacked one floor up sees a masked killer walk past her own bedroom door, and her brain, flooded with adrenaline, fear, drunken confusion, and the simple fact that a human being in extreme terror does not always do the thing you would expect, tells her to lock the door and get back into bed. She does not call the police. She does not run for the front door. She locks her bedroom and gets under the covers. Forensic psychologists call this freeze response. It is the third option in fight or flight that most people forget exists. Sometimes, faced with something the brain cannot process, the body just stops. Dylan, that night, froze. But the next thing she did, and this is important, was text. Starting at 4:22 a.m., Dylan begins texting Bethany, the other surviving roommate, on the first floor. "No, dude," she writes at one point. Like, "I'm freaking out right now." She tells Bethany there is a man in the house. She tries to call the 4 roommates upstairs. She calls Kaylee. She calls Maddie. She calls Zana. She calls Ethan. Nobody answers. By 4:25 a.m., she is calling Bethany on the phone. They are both, by every reading of the records, terrified. They both decide, somehow in their state, that it is probably safer to stay where they are than to leave their rooms. They wait. Sometime around 4:17 a.m., a security camera on a nearby house picks up audio. Investigators would later describe it as distorted voices, a whimper, a loud thud, and a dog barking. That is, in all likelihood, the audio of the actual murders. By 4:20 a.m., Khonengber leaves, out the sliding glass door, into the backyard, to his car. He drives away. Inside the house, Dylan and Bethany eventually fall asleep, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe out of dissociation. The next time either of them is fully awake is in the late morning. I want to talk for a second about what was actually happening upstairs while Dylan was texting in her locked bedroom. Because the prosecution, at the plea hearing, gave the first clean public reconstruction of it. Bill Thompson, the prosecutor, told the court that Khonengber went up to the 3rd floor first. He went to Maddie's room. Maddie and Kaylee had ended up in the same bedroom that night, sharing a bed. By family accounts, this was a not uncommon thing for them. Best friends since middle school. The two of them were asleep when Khonengber came into the room. He killed Maddie first, by the prosecution's reconstruction, Then he killed Kaylee. On the way back down, on the second floor, he encountered Zana. She had been awake, eating her DoorDash food, scrolling TikTok. Whatever the sequence was, door opening, sound, she saw him. Ethan was on the bed in the room with her. Thompson said in court that Khonengber likely had not expected to encounter either of them. They were unplanned. He killed Zana, he killed Ethan. He left. A knife sheath was found on Maddie's bed. Tan, leather, snap closure. The brand stamped into the leather, K-bar. A K-bar fixed blade knife by all forensic accounts is what he had used. The knife itself, the murder weapon, has never been found. 3 years of searching, drones, cadaver dogs, divers in nearby ponds. They never recovered the actual knife, but the sheath stayed on the bed. On the snap closure of the sheath in microscopic amounts was a single source of male DNA. Touch DNA. The kind you leave behind when you handle something with your bare skin. That DNA, 6 weeks later, would be the thread that pulled the whole case apart for him. At 11:58 a.m. on November 13, 2022, Bethany, the first-floor roommate, called 911. The transcript shows her telling the operator that one of their roommates was unconscious, that she didn't know what was happening, that somebody needed to come. Officers arrived. They walked through the front door. They went up to the second floor. They saw Zana and Ethan first. They went up to the third floor. They saw Maddie and Kaylee. By every account from the responding officers, and there is body cam from this that has since been partially released, the scene broke them. One officer, on the redacted body camera footage, can be heard sighing heavily and stepping back into the hallway. Another can be heard, outside, telling friends and family members who had started arriving at the house, including some of the victims' parents, who would learn about their children's deaths in this way, that they could not go inside. Dylan and Bethany were huddled in blankets outside the house by the time the cameras rolled. Dylan was crying. She told the officer, on camera, that she had heard Kaylee scream, that she had seen the guy. That was the first time anybody in law enforcement learned that there had been a witness. The Moscow Police Department, the Idaho State Police, and the FBI all moved in within hours. By the next morning, the 4 victims' names were public. By the end of the week, the entire country knew about the case. The press parked outside the King Roadhouse. TikTok investigators started theorizing. Reddit forums filled up with speculation. People accused on social media, professors at the university. They accused random men who had been seen in the area. They accused a frat brother. They accused a food truck worker. The wave of online speculation was, by the public estimate of one investigator, one of the worst the Moscow PD had ever seen. For 6 weeks, the actual investigators said almost nothing. What they were doing behind the scenes was 3 things in parallel. The first was DNA, the single-source male profile from the sheath. They ran it through the standard FBI database, CODIS, no hit. The killer did not have his DNA on file with any law enforcement agency in the country. They had a profile. They did not have a name. The second was the white car. Dylan's description, plus the surveillance cameras around the King Roadhouse, had given them a partial picture. A white sedan, possibly a Hyundai Elantra, model year around 2014 to 2016. They put out a national bulletin. They started reviewing every traffic camera and surveillance camera within 50 miles of Moscow. Investigators in Washington State and Idaho State Patrol began running plates on every white Elantra in the region. The third, and this is the one that broke the case, was investigative genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy, in true crime, is a relatively recent technique. It got its first real public use in the Golden State Killer case in 2018. The idea is simple. You take the DNA profile of an unknown suspect, in this case the touch DNA from the knife sheath, and you compare it not to a criminal database but to public ancestry databases, where ordinary people have voluntarily uploaded their genetic profiles to find distant relatives. Sites like GED Match, sites like Family Tree DNA. You look not for the killer himself, but for his cousins, his second cousins, his third cousins. People who share segments of DNA with him because they share ancestors. You build a family tree from the matches, then you narrow. The way the actual genealogy work happens, in cases like this one, is the part nobody outside law enforcement really sees. There is a small set of private companies, most famously Othram and Parabon Nanolabs, that the FBI and state agencies contract with. The lab takes the unknown profile and uploads it with the right consent flags into the public databases. They get a list of matches. Usually in a case like Khonengber's, the closest matches are not first cousins. They are third or fourth cousins, people who share an ancestor with the suspect from 3 or 4 generations back. The genealogists then build, by hand, a complete family tree of that ancestral line. Census records, marriage records, birth records, death records. They build trees with hundreds of branches. Then they narrow, by age, by geography, by sex, until they get to a small number of candidates. And then they cross-reference with anything else investigators have. That work, in the Khonengber case, took the FBI's contracted lab a matter of weeks. By the second week of December 2022, by every report I have seen, they had a name. Brayan Christopher Khonengber, Pennsylvania-born, currently in Pullman, Washington. PhD criminology student at Washington State, 2.5 hours from Moscow, Idaho. The FBI brought in a private genetic genealogy lab to run the sheath DNA. Within days of getting a workable profile uploaded into the public databases, they had identified a family tree that pointed toward a specific cluster of people in northeastern Pennsylvania. Within a couple of weeks, they had a single name: Brayan Khonengber. By mid-December of 2022, FBI agents were quietly surveilling Khonengber in Pullman, Washington. They watched him at his apartment. They watched him driving the white Elantra. They watched him going to work at WSU. They watched him going home to his parents' house in Pennsylvania for the Christmas break. His father had flown out and they drove cross-country together. A road trip that has, in retrospect, become one of the strangest details of this whole case. A father driving across America with his son, while the FBI followed them in unmarked vehicles every mile for days. Picture that drive, a father and son in a car for 3,000 miles. They stop at gas stations. They stop at fast food. They sleep at motels. They talk about whatever fathers and sons talk about: work, college, the weather, the family. And behind them, sometimes 1 car back, sometimes 3, federal agents are filming everything. They are documenting where the car stops. They are documenting which gas stations they use. They are pulling trash bags from the dumpsters of the motels where they stay overnight. They are looking for anything that the son touches that he later throws away. Anything that might let them get his own DNA without yet showing him their cards. Michael Khonengber, the father, by every account I have read, did not know any of this was happening. He thought, by all available evidence, that he was driving his son home for the holidays. They needed one last piece of evidence to confirm. They needed Khonengber's actual DNA, not just a genealogy match. So they did what investigators always do in cases like this. They waited for him to throw something away. In this case, on the morning of December 27th, 2022, they collected trash from his parents' house in Pennsylvania. Inside the trash, they found DNA on a Q-tip, described in court documents as belonging to Khonengber's father. The paternal DNA matched, at a parent-child level, the male DNA from the sheath. That was the confirmation. On the night of December 30th, 2022, FBI agents and Pennsylvania State Police executed a search warrant at the Khonengber family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. They went in around 3 in the morning. They arrested Brayan Khonengber in the kitchen. He was wearing latex gloves. He had been, by the search team's later report, sorting his trash into separate bags. He was 28 years old. He was, that night, 2 months into his first semester of a criminology PhD program. He had been studying that fall how to investigate exactly this kind of case. I want to give you the picture of that arrest, because there are details from it that, when you read them in the affidavits, are bizarre. The Khonengber family home in Albrightsville is in a wooded subdivision called Indian Mountain Lake Estates. The street was quiet. By the night of December 29th, FBI agents had set up surveillance positions in vehicles, and they had a tactical team on standby for the arrest. The warrant team went in at 1:30 a.m. Eastern Time on December 30th. Helicopters overhead. Local PA State Police sealed off the street. Armored vehicles, tactical agents with rifles. They breached the front door. Brayan Khonengber, by the team's later reporting, was in the kitchen. He was in a t-shirt and shorts. He was wearing the latex gloves, the kind you would wear to handle food, or, if you knew exactly what investigators look for, to handle anything you did not want your fingerprints on. He had been sorting his garbage. His parents and one of his sisters, who were home at the time, were also detained for questioning. They were cleared and released within hours. The reason that latex gloves in the kitchen detail mattered beyond the optics is what it suggests about his state of mind in the days before. He had been watching the news. He had to know by late December that investigators were homing in. He had to suspect that DNA evidence was at the center of the case. He had to be preparing for the possibility that he would be the suspect they came for. And what he was doing about it, by every available reading of the arrest scene, was wearing gloves while he sorted his own household trash, trying to make sure his own DNA was not on any disposable item that might leave the house. But that operation had already been beaten. The FBI had pulled DNA off his father's discarded Q-tip 3 days earlier, by a different route entirely. He was extradited from Pennsylvania to Idaho in early January 2023. By the time the FBI's plane landed in Pullman, the entire country was watching. Press helicopters tracked the transport vehicles. News crews waited at the courthouse. His first court appearance on January 5, 2023, was streamed live across the country. He sat in a Latah County courtroom in an orange jumpsuit. He was advised of the charges. He was held without bail. I want to tell you what investigators found in the weeks after the arrest, in the rooms of his life, because the inventory is itself a piece of evidence. In his apartment in Pullman, they found a Glock handgun and ammunition, multiple computers and hard drives, a copy of a book by Peter Vronsky titled American Serial Killers, black clothing, gloves. They also found that he had, in the days after the murders, deeply cleaned the car, wiped down. By all forensic accounts, an attempt at evidence destruction by a person who knew what evidence techs would look for. In his Amazon order history, prosecutors found this. In March of 2022, 8 months before the murders, Khonengber had ordered a Ka-bar knife, a Ka-bar sheath, and a Ka-bar sharpener. He had also, by his account history, deleted the order history shortly after the murders. In his phone records, prosecutors found this. In the 4 months before the murders, Khonengber's phone had pinged cell towers in the vicinity of 1122 King Road in the late evening hours on 12 separate occasions. On the night of the murders themselves, his phone went off, meaning was either turned off or placed into airplane mode. At 2:47 a.m. on November 13th, it came back on at 4:48 a.m. that same morning. That 2-hour blackout window covers the entire time frame of the killings. His phone was, by every metric the investigators could use, the phone of a man who knew what cell phone records can do, and who tried badly to defeat them. That last detail is the thing about Brayan Khonengber I cannot stop coming back to. He was a criminology PhD student. He had spent years studying how investigations work. He knew about CODIS. He knew about genetic genealogy. He knew about cell tower triangulation. He knew about Amazon order history. He knew that touch DNA can be left behind by handling a leather sheath. He knew, in every academic theoretical sense, every single thing that investigators were eventually going to use against him. And he made every single one of those mistakes anyway. He bought the murder weapon on his own Amazon account. He left the sheath at the scene. He drove a registered vehicle past the house 12 times. He turned his phone off in a pattern obvious enough to scream at any analyst looking for it. He kept his clothing and his gloves. He didn't get rid of his car. There is a phrase in criminology. When you study academic theory about a thing, you can sometimes convince yourself that knowing how the thing works means you know how to avoid it. It is the same arrogance that makes med students think they can self-diagnose. It is the same arrogance that makes finance students think they can beat the market. Khonengber, by every available reading of his behavior, believed that knowing the textbook would let him outsmart the people who actually do the work. He was wrong about that. He was, by every measure of his eventual prosecution, exactly the kind of overconfident amateur that the textbooks themselves describe. And the prosecution built its case across the next 2.5 years. The investigation had given them 5 major pieces of evidence: the touch DNA on the sheath, the Amazon purchase history, the cell phone records, the white Hyundai surveillance footage, and the eyewitness identification from Dylan. Combined, those 5 pieces were, by every legal commentator who reviewed the case, overwhelming. Khonengber's defense team, led by attorney Ann Taylor of Idaho, tried for 2.5 years to undermine each piece. They challenged the DNA chain of custody. They challenged the genetic genealogy methods. They argued that the Amazon order history had been improperly obtained. They argued for a venue change, which they got. The trial was moved from Latah County, where the murders happened, to Ada County in Boise because of pretrial publicity. They argued for the death penalty to be taken off the table. They were denied. The trial was scheduled to begin on August 18, 2025. It never happened. I want to take you inside the decision that led to the plea deal because the public reading of it, that the prosecution gave up, is, by every legal expert I have read, not what actually happened. The Idaho prosecution had spent 2.5 years building one of the most evidence-heavy cases in the history of the state. They had the DNA, they had the cell records, they had the Amazon order history, they had the surveillance, they had the eyewitness in Dillon, they had a venue, they had a jury pool. They were ready. What they did not have by the spring of 2025 was the certainty that a death penalty would actually be carried out. Idaho has the death penalty on the books, but it has not executed anyone since 2012, and the state's lethal injection protocol had been blocked by litigation. Even if Kohberger had been convicted at trial and sentenced to death, the appeals process would have stretched by every expert estimate into the 2040s. 20 years of motions. 20 years of the victims' families being dragged back into courtrooms. 20 years of the case being open. The families, by the time the plea offer was made, were also at the limit. Some, like the Chapins and the Mogan family, were ready to be done. They did not want the trial. They did not want the appeals. They wanted, by their public statements, to close the door on the case and start to grieve their children in peace. The Goncalves family wanted the opposite. They wanted the trial. They wanted the jury. They wanted Kohberger to face the death penalty in open court. In late June of 2025, the families of the victims received a letter from the prosecution. The state of Idaho was offering Kohberger a plea deal. He would plead guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. In exchange, the state would not pursue the death penalty. He would receive 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years for the burglary count. He would waive his right to appeal. He would never be a free man again. The families, by every account, were split. The Goncalves family was furious. They wanted a trial. They wanted Kohberger to face a jury. They wanted the death penalty on the table. They went public with their opposition. The Chapin family supported the deal. They did not want years of appeals. They did not want their son's death to play out, in detail, in a courtroom. Aubrey Goncalves, Kaylee's sister, would later say, on the record, that the plea deal felt like the state had given up. On July 2nd, 2025, the Wednesday before the trial was supposed to start, Kohberger walked into the Ada County Courthouse in Boise. He was 30 years old by then. He had been in jail for 2.5 years. He was, by the description of every reporter in the room, gaunt, white button-down shirt, blue tie, short haircut. He greeted his parents with a smile when he walked into the courtroom. Judge Stephen Hippler read out the charges: 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of burglary. The judge then read out each victim's name, each name by the AP and ABC reporters in the courtroom. Cut through the room. Families cried. Reporters cried. Kohberger did not cry. The judge asked Kohberger how he pleaded to count 1, the murder of Madison Mogan. Kohberger said, "Guilty." The judge asked how he pleaded to count 2, the murder of Kaylee Goncalves. Guilty. Count 3, the murder of Zana Kernodle. Guilty. Count 4, the murder of Ethan Chapin. Guilty. Count 5, burglary. Guilty. The judge asked Kohberger if he was pleading guilty because he was, in fact, guilty. Kohberger said, yes. It was the first and only time Kohberger publicly admitted what he had done. The sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, July 23, 2025. Same courtroom, same judge. That sentencing hearing is one of the most emotional pieces of courtroom footage I have ever watched. The victims' families came one by one to the lectern. Kaylee's sister Olivia read a statement that called Kohberger a sociopath, a psychopath, a murderer. Kaylee's other sister Aubrey spoke about her sister's brilliance, that line about lighting up rooms. Maddie's mother Karen Laramie cried through her entire statement. Ethan's mother, Stacy Chapin, spoke about her son's smile. Zana's father spoke about losing a daughter. Dylan, the surviving roommate who had seen the killer in the hallway, came to the lectern. She had not, at any point in the previous 2.5 years, spoken publicly. That day, she did. She spoke through tears about the panic attacks. She spoke about how, on some nights, she still felt like she was 19 years old, still in that house, still hearing footsteps. She said, in her statement, that she could not bring herself to sleep with her bedroom door fully closed anymore. Bethany, the other surviving roommate, did not speak in person. She submitted a written statement, which was read aloud. The line from it that has stuck with everyone who covered the trial is this one: "Why me? Why did I get to live and not them?" Then it was Kohberger's turn. In an American sentencing hearing, the defendant has a right, called the right to allocution, to address the court, to say anything, an apology, an explanation, a motive, a final word. It is, in a case like this, the moment the families have been waiting almost 3 years for. Why? Why my daughter? Why my son? Why these four? Why anyone? Why? The judge asked Kohberger if he wished to make a statement. Kohberger stood up. He looked at the judge. He said, and these are his exact words on the record, "I respectfully decline." That was it. 4 words. He sat back down. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He did not offer a motive. He did not look at the families. He did not look at the photos of the 4 kids he had killed, mounted on easels in the courtroom. He gave the families nothing. Judge Stephen Hippler then handed down the sentence: 4 consecutive life sentences for the 4 murders, without the possibility of parole. 10 years for the burglary, also consecutive. A maximum $30,000 fine on each count. A no-contact order with the victims' families. Kohberger will die in an Idaho prison cell. There are a few details I want to leave you with, because they are the part of this case that I keep coming back to. The first is the house. After the murders, the University of Idaho purchased the property at 1122 King Road. There had been a long debate about what to do with it. Some of the victims' families wanted it preserved as a crime scene, in case the trial required it. Some wanted it destroyed. In late December of 2023, a little over a year after the murders, the university tore it down. The house, by every photograph in the local press, came down in a single afternoon. Bulldozers, dust. Within a week, the lot was empty. There is no plaque. There is no memorial on the site. The university has said the land will eventually be turned into a memorial garden, but as of right now, it is just dirt and weeds on a slope in a college town. The second detail is the motive. We still don't know. 3 years of investigation. The plea hearing offered nothing. The sentencing hearing offered nothing. The prosecutor, Bill Thompson, was asked directly at a press conference after the sentencing whether the state had ever determined a motive. He said, and this is on the public record, that there was no evidence Kohberger had a background of violence or a criminal history before he decided, sometime in the fall of 2022, to commit this crime. No history with the victims, no connection to them, no relationship, no grudge, no reason that any investigator has been able to find. Just a 28-year-old criminology PhD student who, one night, decided to drive 8 miles and walk into a house full of strangers with a K-bar knife. And who, after he did it, sat through a guilty plea and a sentencing and chose, with full knowledge of what it would do to the families, to tell them nothing. The third detail, and the one I cannot get past, is Dylan in the hallway. She was 20 years old. She had been out drinking with her friends. She was tired. She was a little drunk. She was disoriented in the way anyone is in the middle of the night. She opened her bedroom door. She saw a masked man in black walking past her. Their eyes met. 3 to 5 seconds, by her own count. He kept walking. For 3 years, that detail, why he kept walking, why he didn't kill her too, has been the thing that everybody covering this case has tried to figure out. Some criminal profilers have said he was already exiting. He had completed what he came to do. He didn't want to add another victim. Some have said he was tired. Some have said that, in the moment, even he froze. I don't think anyone will ever know. What I do know, after spending the past few weeks inside this case, is that Dylan is the one person in this story who, by sheer chance, lived to tell us what the killer looked like. Without her, the eyewitness description of the masked man with the bushy eyebrows does not exist. The connection from the sheath DNA to a real human being arguably takes longer. Maybe years longer. Maybe never. She froze. She locked her door. She got back into bed. And in doing those three things, by all evidence, she stayed alive. And then, when the police finally arrived, 8 hours later, she remembered enough. So let me ask you what I have been asking myself. After walking through this whole case from start to finish, Brayan Khonengber spent 4 years studying criminology. He read the books. He took the classes. He posted the surveys. He sat in seminars where professors walked through famous cases. He knew, intellectually, every single technique investigators would eventually use to catch him. And he did it anyway. He left the sheath. He used his own Amazon account. He drove his own registered car. He did exactly the things his own coursework would have told him not to do. What do you think the answer is? Was Brayan Khonengber overconfident, arrogant, convinced he was the one student who really had figured it out? Or was he, somewhere underneath the criminology degree and the academic posturing, exactly the kind of disorganized, compulsion-driven killer the textbooks describe, incapable, in the moment, of doing the things he could write about so easily on paper? And the harder question, does it matter? 4 kids are dead. 3 sets of parents will spend the rest of their lives without their children. 2 surviving roommates will spend the rest of their lives in a house, on a hallway, in a moment that none of them ever asked to be in. Khonengber, sitting in a cell in an Idaho prison, gave them 4 words at his sentencing. I respectfully decline. 4 words. That is what he chose to leave them with. Tell me in the comments what you think. Tell me what you think the motive was. Tell me what you would have wanted to hear from him at that lectern. A criminology student who thought he'd outsmarted everyone. Our last guy had 24 years on the force, was months from retirement, and threw it all away in one night. He showed up in full uniform, with his service weapon, and what he said in court afterward made the judge stop him mid-sentence.
Hunting Christie like an animal.
He is evil. Evil.
Gunning down his wife, the mother of his children, while she's desperately trying to get help.
I'm sorry that it happened. But
She's running, barefoot in a t-shirt, down a quiet suburban driveway in the middle of the night. She's already been shot. She knows she's been shot. Her hands are pressed against her own ribs as she runs. She's trying to get to the neighbor's house. 2 doors down, the porch light is on. There are kids in the house behind her, her own kids. And there is a man inside that house, the man she used to be married to, the man who was supposed to be a police lieutenant, and he is reloading. She makes it to the neighbor's front steps. She raises her hand to knock. That's where he catches up to her. Jefferson Township, New Jersey. About 11:30 at night on Sunday, July 14th, 2019. The street is called Mirror Place. The neighbors hear 3 shots. They think it's fireworks. It's a Sunday night in July. Lots of people still have leftover firecrackers from the 4th. Everybody goes back to whatever they were watching on TV. Christy Solaro Formisano dies on a stranger's front porch. The man who shot her gets back in his car. He drives. He still has his Newark Police Department uniform on. He still has the badge. He still has the gun. He even places a fake 911 call on the way to make it sound like the shooter was somebody else. Then he goes to his mother's house in Livingston, New Jersey, about 30 miles away, parks the car, and waits to see what happens next. What happens next is that police find him at his mom's place around 2 in the morning. They take him into custody. They open the trunk of the car he was driving. The gun is in there, his own service weapon. They put him in the back of the cruiser. He's a 24-year veteran of the Newark PD acting lieutenant. He knows what every step of this booking process is going to feel like, because he has done it to other people about 1,000 times. I came across this case the first time scrolling through news headlines, and I read the first paragraph and assumed it was going to be one of those domestic violence cases where the husband was a regular guy nobody had on their radar. Reading further, when I realized the husband was a sitting police lieutenant, in uniform, using his service weapon, I had to stop and reread it, twice. because there's a particular kind of betrayal in this case that runs deeper than a normal homicide. He had taken an oath. He had a badge that meant, to the public, exactly the opposite of what he did that night. And he used the cover of that badge, the uniform, the gun, the credibility, to do something he had spent his career, in theory, preventing. This is the case I want to tell you about today. Not because of the badge, although the badge is part of it. Because of the way a man can stand at a closing of a marriage that he himself wrecked, and instead of walking away, decide to take everybody with him. If true crime is your thing, hit subscribe before we get into it. Free, takes a second, helps me keep doing these. Okay, let me back this whole thing up. Because to understand what happened on Mirror Place that night, we have to talk about Christy. We have to talk about who she actually was, because the news coverage moved on fast and her name became a number, and I don't want her to be a number in this video. Christy Solaro Formisano was 37 years old, born in Ridgewood, New Jersey, grew up in Garfield, graduated from Garfield High School, went to William Patterson University. By the time she was in her late 20s, she'd settled into the job she would have for most of her adult life, an assistant behavior specialist at the Morris School District. If you don't know what that job is, the short version is, she worked with kids who were struggling, kids with behavior problems, kids with developmental things, kids who other adults had given up on or were about to give up on. Christy's whole job was to sit with those kids and figure out what they needed. Her family said in her obituary, and you can find this online, they said she dedicated her life to being around children. Her colleagues at the Morris School District after her death talked about her in a very specific way. They said she was the person who got assigned the hard cases, the kids no one else could handle, the kids who, in another era, would have just been written off as bad. Christy didn't see bad kids. She saw kids who hadn't been given what they needed yet. She was the patient one, the calm one, the one who could de-escalate a screaming 9-year-old without raising her own voice. There's a particular kind of person who chooses that line of work, and Christy was that person. Soft-spoken, tough underneath, endlessly patient with other people's children, and, as her family points out, even more patient with her own. She had 2 of her own, Rachel and Ryan. They were elementary school age in 2019. They were her whole world. The obituary used that exact phrase, whole world. Whether it was Girl Scouts, dance recitals, swim meets, every soccer game on a Saturday, every birthday party on a Sunday, Christy was there, coffee in one hand, snacks in the other. Her house was the holiday house. Christmas, Thanksgiving, anything. Everybody ended up at Christy's. Her family used to joke that she'd been planning Christmas dinner since August. She decorated for every season. The front yard at Mirror Place had pumpkins in October, lights in December, plastic Easter eggs in April. She was the kind of mom who would pull the kids' friends into the holiday photos because she didn't want anyone to feel left out. She also had a husband, John Formisano, Newark cop, big guy, mustache, 20-plus years on the force. He'd worked his way up to acting lieutenant. He had the kind of resume you'd put on a recruiting poster. Christy and John had met young. They got married. They moved to Jefferson Township in 2010, to a quiet street called Mirror Place, in a neighborhood called Oak Ridge. Big trees, kids on bikes, above-ground pools in the backyards, the kind of street where, on the front side, you don't have problems. Behind the front side, the marriage was over. It had been over for a while. By the summer of 2019, John and Christy were in the middle of a divorce, a bad one. People who knew them in passing said they'd been separated for months. Christy had stayed in the Mirror Place house with the 2 kids. John had moved out. The financial side, the custody side, the legal side, all of it was being fought out in lawyers' offices. None of it was clean. This is the kind of split that, in a normal couple, ends with each person sitting on the floor of a new apartment, eating Chinese food alone, crying a little, then eventually moving on with their life. But John Formisano was not having that kind of summer. He'd been with Christy for most of his adult life. He had a badge and a uniform and a service weapon and a self-image that depended on being the man in charge of his own house. And his ex was about to start dating somebody else. That somebody else was a man named Timothy Simonson, 40 years old, decent guy. He'd been seeing Christy for about a month by mid-July. They were still in that early stage of dating where you're texting a lot and not announcing it on social media. Tim knew Christy was in the middle of a divorce. He knew it was complicated. He treated her well. According to his later testimony in court, the relationship was new, but it was good. They liked each other. They were figuring it out. Midnight. On the night of Sunday, July 14th, 2019, Tim came over to Christy's house on Mirror Place. The kids, Rachel and Ryan, were home. They were already in bed. It was a normal Sunday. Christy and Tim had dinner. They were upstairs. I'm going to walk you through what we know about the next 45 minutes, because the timeline of this case is important. Some of it comes from Tim Simonson's own testimony at trial. Some of it comes from John Formisano's later interview with detectives. Some of it comes from the neighbors. And some of it comes from the simple physical evidence of where bodies were when police arrived. Around 11 o'clock at night, John Formisano called Christy's cell phone. Tim could hear part of the call. He didn't get the whole thing. But Christy hung up. She looked at Tim. She said something like, "John just called. He's mad. He says he's coming over." Then she said something else, something she'd seen out the bedroom window. She told Tim, "There's a flashlight outside. Somebody with a flashlight in our yard." Now think about that for a second. Christy knew her husband was angry. She'd just gotten off the phone with him, and she sees a flashlight outside in the dark. She's not at a campsite. There's no reason for there to be a flashlight on her property at 11 at night. A flashlight on a residential lawn at night is one of two things. It's a delivery man or it's a cop. And the cop she was thinking of, the one she had just been on the phone with, was her husband. I don't know what she said in the next 30 seconds. I don't know if she told Tim to hide. I don't know if she went downstairs. What I do know, from the timeline put together by Morris County prosecutors, is that around 11:21 p.m., the Jefferson Township Police Department got the first 911 call from Mirror Place. Shots fired, multiple callers, the neighbors describing what sounded, at first, like fireworks. By the time the first cruiser made it to the cul-de-sac, the front door of one Mirror Place was open and Christy wasn't inside. She was 2 houses down, on the front porch of 5 Mirror Place, lying on the steps. Police would describe her in the official statement as deceased on scene. A neighbor, a woman named Yuli Rivera, told the local press the morning after, "We heard 3 shots. Just 3. That was it." She'd looked out the window. She'd seen nothing. She'd gone back to her show. By the time her brain caught up to what the sound had really been, the man with the gun had already left. Tim Simonson was upstairs in the house. He'd been shot multiple times. Investigators would later say he'd been shot during the initial encounter, when John Formisano came up the stairs into the master bedroom and started firing. The kids, Rachel and Ryan, were in their rooms. They were not physically hurt. They had heard everything. They had heard their dad fire into their mom's bedroom, and they had heard their mom run, and they had heard the shots that killed her on the neighbor's porch. Let me say something about that, and then I want to move on, because I don't want to dwell. Those 2 children are alive today. They live with Christy's brother, Mike Solaro. Mike was appointed their legal guardian. They have their mom's dog, Ellie. They have aunts and uncles and cousins. They have a community in Jefferson that has rallied around them. A retired cop who'd worked with John Formisano, a guy named Miko Velas, started a GoFundMe for the kids within days. The community blew past the goal. Strangers in 3 states sent money. The kids will not want for material things. What they will live with for the rest of their lives is a Sunday night in July when they were 8 or 9 years old, in their pajamas, and their dad came home with a gun. Okay, I want to back up. Because if I just tell you the story of that one night, I'm telling you the wrong story. The right story starts months earlier, with the cracks. John Formisano was 48 years old in July 2019. He'd been with the Newark Police Department for almost a quarter century. He'd worked his way up, acting lieutenant. The kind of guy who, when you're a young rookie, you call sir without thinking about it. If you've never seen Newark PD up close, it's one of the bigger urban police departments in the state. Hard town, hard calls. Newark in the 2000s and 2010s had a homicide problem, a gang problem, and a poverty problem that ran underneath all of it. The cops who survived that environment for 20-plus years are, by definition, hard people. They've seen things. They've been to homes after homicides. They've notified families. They've worked overtime in body armor in July. By the time they make lieutenant, they've earned every gray hair on their head. John had earned all of that. On paper, he was respected. Newark PD didn't promote you to acting lieutenant unless you'd put in the work. He had supervisors who would later, when the news broke, refuse to give comment because they couldn't make sense of what they were hearing. But that wasn't really the whole picture, and it never had been. People who knew the marriage said John was controlling in the way controlling cops can be controlling. Not yelling, not throwing things, just quietly making sure the rules of the house were his. Where Christy went, who she saw, what she wore, how she spent money. Christy had her own job, her own income, her own family. But the day-to-day was always going to be on John's terms. There's a pattern here that researchers have written about for decades, and you can read the studies if you want. The rate of domestic violence in law enforcement families is significantly higher than in the general population. The numbers vary depending on which study you read, but the rough estimate, going back to studies from the late 1990s, is that somewhere between 2 and 4 times as many police households have a domestic violence incident as a household at random. It's a stat that police departments don't love to talk about, because acknowledging it forces a conversation about what to do with the cops who do it. Charge them, and you lose an officer. Don't charge them, and you have a domestic abuser carrying a service weapon. I'm not saying all cops. I'm not saying most cops. I'm saying the rate is higher, and that's part of the soil this particular case grew out of. The marriage had been over for a long time in any meaningful sense, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. Some couples manage that and find a way out. Some couples just keep dancing around each other. And some couples, well, with some couples, the husband cannot accept that his wife has the right to leave. And when she does anyway, his brain has a meltdown. By spring of 2019, Christy had filed for divorce. John had moved out of the Mirror Place house. He was at his mother's place in Livingston a lot of the time. He was working his Newark shifts. He was, on paper, doing what an adult is supposed to do when his marriage ends. Keep showing up. Keep going to work. Keep being a parent to the kids on weekends. Wait for the lawyers to finish. That's not what was actually happening in his head. Investigators would later go through John Formisano's phone records, his texts, his behavior in the weeks leading up to July 14th. They would find, and the prosecutor laid this out at trial, a man who could not let go, who was still calling Christy at all hours, who was still demanding to know where she was, who was still showing up at the house unannounced, who was, by July, watching her, following her. The flashlight in the yard wasn't a one-time thing, it was the latest in a pattern. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make it sound like Christy was naive. She wasn't. She knew her husband was struggling with the divorce. She knew he was angry. She'd told friends. She'd had conversations with her family. But she was also a woman in 2019 in suburban New Jersey, and she did what most women in that position do. She tried to make it work, civilly, for the sake of the kids. She let John come over to drop things off. She answered his calls. She didn't get an order of protection. She didn't change the locks. She tried to keep things normal because her 2 kids were 8 and 9 years old, and their world was already coming apart, and she didn't want to break it any further. That's the part of this story that, when I read it, just sits with me. Because Christy was doing exactly what we tell women in that position to do. Stay calm. Keep it amicable. Don't escalate. Don't poke the bear. We tell them that as a society, we tell them that's the mature path. And then we have this Sunday night where the mature path ends on the neighbor's porch. So now you have a man who has decided, somewhere in his head, that this is not allowed to happen. That his wife is not allowed to have a new boyfriend. That his wife is not allowed to live a separate life. That his marriage isn't really over because he hasn't agreed that it's over. Let me walk you through the evening of July 14th, 2019, with what we know from the trial record. Earlier that day, John Formisano had been working his Newark shift. He was an acting lieutenant. He was in uniform. The official line, when prosecutors filed it later, was that he was technically off duty when he left work that evening, but he had not changed out of his uniform. He was still wearing the badge. He had his service weapon on his hip. He got into his vehicle. He drove to Jefferson Township. The drive from Newark up to Oak Ridge is about an hour, depending on traffic. Long, dark roads through rural Morris County. Time to think. Time to talk yourself into something, or out of something, he chose into. There's a small detail from the case file that I want to put in here because it's the kind of thing that, in court, makes a juror's stomach turn. Investigators would later reconstruct from his phone's GPS data that John Formisano had taken a slight detour on his way to Christie's house. He'd driven past the property once, slowly, without stopping. Then he'd circled back. Then he'd called her. That's not the timeline of a man dropping off glasses. That's the timeline of a man doing a perimeter check on his own ex-wife's home, looking to see if there was an extra car in the driveway, looking to see if there were lights on in rooms there shouldn't be, looking, in his head, for evidence to confirm a story he had already written. Around 11, he called Christie. He'd later tell investigators something that I think is the linchpin of this whole case. He'd say he wanted to come over to drop off a pair of glasses for one of the kids, glasses, at 11 at night, on a Sunday. That's not the story of a co-parent doing a delivery. That's the story of a man building a pretext. Glasses give you a reason to be at the front door. Glasses give you a reason to use your key. Glasses make it possible to say later, I just wanted to drop off some glasses, Your Honor. I had no intention of doing what I did. But look, the glasses were never the point. The phone call before the visit was the point. He called her to find out who else was there. Christie on the phone told him she had company. We don't know exactly how she phrased it, but Tim Simonson testified that Christie hung up the call and looked worried. Tim and Christie were upstairs. Christie went to a window. She saw the flashlight in the yard. She told Tim. Tim called 911 from his phone, and this is a detail you might want to remember. Tim Simonson had already dialed 911 before John Formisano made it to the front door. They knew something bad was coming. They just didn't have time. The 911 call from Tim's phone, when prosecutors played it later in court, was about as upsetting a piece of audio as a jury ever has to hear. You can hear Tim trying to explain what's happening. You can hear Christie in the background. Then you hear the front door downstairs. Then you hear the footsteps on the staircase. Then you hear shots. The dispatcher, on the other end of that call, did everything dispatchers are trained to do. She kept the line open. She tried to get information. She sent units. By the time the responding officers were rolling up Mirror Place, the call was still active and the dispatcher was listening to a house in chaos. John walked in, used a key, came up the stairs, saw what he expected to see, his ex-wife with another man. This is where, in the police interview later, John Formisano gives the most quoted line of the whole case. He told the detective, "I blacked out. I blacked out." The phrase that abusers and killers reach for when they need a moral pass on something they planned for hours. I blacked out. Just lost myself. Just couldn't help it. I have read enough of these cases to tell you that when a man says I blacked out, he means I made a decision I knew I would have to live with, and I would prefer not to. The blackout is a story he is telling himself, retroactively, to make the next 20 years of court appearances easier. Tim Simonson got shot multiple times in the master bedroom. He's a big guy. He took several rounds and somehow stayed alive long enough to get out, get to a neighbor, get help. He would later go through several surgeries. He survived. He testified. Christie made it out of the house. She'd been hit. She ran out the front door, into the driveway, barefoot, and toward the closest neighbor's house. 2 doors down. Number 5, Mirror Place. The porch light was on. She made it to the front steps. John Formisano followed her. The prosecutor, much later in court, used a phrase I cannot get out of my head. He said, "We see Mr. Formisano hunting Christie like an animal. Hold that image for a second. A woman running for her life on a sidewalk on Mirror Place, in a quiet New Jersey cul-de-sac, knocking on a door that's not going to open in time, while the man she shared a life with, the man whose 2 children she'd had, walks calmly up behind her in his uniform with his work gun and finishes what he started." That's a long way from anybody blacking out. That's somebody who knew exactly what he was doing. A neighbor on the street in the chaos actually saw John Formisano outside in the moments before or after the final shots. The neighbor asked him what he was doing. Just outside, in the dark, in the middle of all this noise. John told him, the prosecutor quoted this line at sentencing, that he was just doing some busy work. Some busy work. While Christie was dying on a porch 2 houses down. Even reading that 2 years later, I had to set my phone down for a minute. He got back in his vehicle. He drove. On the way, He placed a false 911 call to misdirect the responding officers. He was a cop. He knew how to make it sound real. He used the dispatcher language he knew. He pointed the responders away from where he actually was. Then he drove to his mother's house in Livingston, about 30 miles away. He parked. He didn't even put the gun back into his apartment. He left it in the trunk. He sat there. He waited. He had to know it was coming. It came. Around 2 in the morning on July 15th, police located him at his mother's place. They took him into custody. They opened the trunk. They recovered his service weapon. They took him to a station and read him his rights. The arrest itself was orderly. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. The officers who took him in were not from his own department. Newark PD obviously could not arrest one of their own lieutenants in this situation. The agency that handled the booking was Morris County, with assistance from the Livingston Police. Different uniforms, different building, different rules of engagement. The cop who'd run the playbook 1,000 times was, for the first time in his career, on the wrong side of it. He knew, walking through that station door, that everything from that minute on was going to be on the record. This is where the "I blacked out" phrase came in. He told detectives the version of the story he wanted them to buy. He'd come over to drop off glasses. He suspected Christie had a man in the bedroom. He blacked out. He remembered firing his gun multiple times. End of story. Detectives are not stupid. The story didn't survive contact with the evidence. The phone call before he showed up. The fake 911 call after. The drive to Mom's house. The 30 miles he'd put between himself and the scene. None of that is the behavior of a man who blacked out. That's the behavior of a man who knew exactly what he had done and was already 3 moves into trying to talk his way out of it. He was suspended from the Newark Police Department without pay within hours. Public Safety Director Anthony Ambrose gave a statement to the press that day. He said, quote, "Lieutenant Formisano's colleagues in our police division were shocked by the news of the shooting. He called it a tragedy beyond comprehension. He used the kind of language that police departments use when they need to put distance between themselves and a brother in blue who just made the worst kind of headline. Within months, they began formal termination proceedings. By the time he was convicted 3 years later, he was no longer a member of any police force." Newark PD also got asked in the weeks after whether there had been any prior internal affairs complaints against John Formisano, any flags, any indicators. The department declined to give a full answer in public, citing personnel privacy rules. What they did say was that Formisano had been a long-tenured officer in good standing at the time of the incident. Reading between the lines of that statement, what it means is, if there had been red flags in his file, the department was not going to lead with them. Now I want to do something I think is worth doing in cases like this because we owe it to the woman who died. Let me talk about her for a minute. Separate from her death, Christie's brother, Mike Solaro, did some interviews after she was killed. So did her stepfather, Dale Wagner. So did her mom, Debbie. Reading their statements, you get a picture of a woman who was, and I mean this, relentlessly normal, in the best way. She wasn't famous, she wasn't on TV, she wasn't running a nonprofit. She was a middle-class New Jersey mom who worked with kids during the day and went home and worked with her own kids at night. She made dinner, she did the laundry, she set up the holiday meals. She had a Facebook page where she'd post photos of Rachel and Ryan. The photos were the regular stuff: Halloween costumes, dance recitals, swim meets, first day of school. Christie wasn't trying to be an influencer. She was just keeping a record of her kids' lives because that's what moms do. The day after she died, Mike, her brother, put out a statement that asked for privacy and asked, instead of flowers, for donations to the kids. Within a week, the GoFundMe was approaching $30,000. By the time the trial ended, it had brought in significantly more. The money went into a fund. Mike was the trustee. The kids got it for school, for therapy, for whatever was going to come next. There's something worth pausing on about who started that fundraiser. The GoFundMe wasn't set up by Christie's family. It was set up by a retired Newark police officer named Miko Velez. He had worked alongside John Formisano on the Newark force. He'd known the man. They'd been brothers in blue, in the language cops use. And after the murder, Miko Velez looked at what his old colleague had done, and instead of staying silent, which is what a lot of cops do when one of their own goes down, he stood up. He started a fund. He made sure the children of his friend's victim were taken care of. That's not a small thing. That's a man choosing the right side at a moment when a lot of his peers chose to look the other way. I want to give credit where credit is due. Miko Velez did the right thing, fast, and he did it in public. The fund he set up is part of why Rachel and Ryan are okay today, or as okay as kids in their situation can be. Christy's funeral was held at Our Lady Queen of Peace Church in Maywood, New Jersey. The visiting hours were the Sunday before, at Kugler Community Home for Funerals in Saddlebrook. The line of people who showed up went out the door and around the block. People who'd worked with her at Morris School District. Former students, now grown, neighbors, family. Cops who'd known her through John but had chosen to remember her as her own person, not as their colleague's wife. She was buried at George Washington Memorial Park Cemetery in Paramus, New Jersey, right back in the part of the state she'd grown up in. Her mother, Debbie Wagner, would later stand in a courtroom and read victim impact statements that were, by every account I've read of them, the most painful part of the sentencing. She wasn't loud. She didn't curse out John Formisano. She just talked about her daughter. And she said something I want to read to you because it's the line that captures this whole case better than anything else I could write. She said, "Being a mother was her greatest joy. It is on him that their childhood is shattered and broken." That's the sentence. The only honest one anybody said in that whole courtroom. Okay, let me walk you through the legal part. Because the legal part is its own thing. John Formisano was charged within days with murder, attempted murder, possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose, and endangering the welfare of children. The endangering charge was specifically because Rachel and Ryan were home when he did this. There would later be added charges: official misconduct, weapons charges, and hindering apprehension or prosecution. The official misconduct charge was because he had been wearing his uniform and used his service weapon to commit the crime. The hindering charge was because he placed that false 911 call to misdirect responders. He was held without bail. He was sent for psychological evaluation. In January 2020, a judge ruled him competent to stand trial. That's a legal status, not a moral one. It just means the court found he could understand the charges against him and assist in his own defense. The case then sat, not because anybody was dragging their feet, but because, look, that's how the New Jersey court system worked in 2020. The pandemic shut down jury trials across the state. Cases were rescheduled. Hearings happened over Zoom. Families who had been waiting for justice had to wait longer. For Christy's family, the 3 years between the murder and the trial were not 3 years of moving on. They were 3 years of suspended grief. You can't really start healing while you're still waiting for the day in court. So they sat with it. They went to anniversaries with empty chairs at the table. They watched Rachel and Ryan grow up a little. They went to therapy. They held each other together. And they waited. John Formisano, meanwhile, was at the Morris County Correctional Facility. He was in protective custody because, you don't put an ex-cop on a general population block. Bad for everyone's health. He had access to phones and visitors and a court-appointed legal team. He had a defense attorney named Anthony Iaculo, who'd handled high-profile cases in New Jersey before. Prosecutors offered him a plea deal. The details were never made fully public, but what we know is the deal would have capped his prison time at about 40 years. He turned it down. Think about that for a second. 40 years for a man in his late 40s means you maybe see daylight again somewhere in your mid-80s. Most defendants in this position take that deal because the alternative is worse. There's also a psychological piece to it. Pleading guilty is an admission. It's accepting what you did. And John Formisano, even with a plea on the table, could not bring himself to do that. John Formisano took the alternative. He wanted to go to trial. His defense was, in summary, the blackout. His attorney would later argue that he had been in such a state of emotional disturbance, finding his estranged wife with another man, that he could not be held to the standard of premeditated first-degree murder. The defense would argue for a lesser charge, like manslaughter or passion provocation manslaughter, which is a specific category in New Jersey for killings done in the heat of the moment. If you've never heard of passion provocation manslaughter, it's a doctrine that goes back centuries in English and American law. The original idea was, if a man finds his wife in bed with another man and kills them both in a fit of rage, his crime is somehow less severe than a man who plans a murder weeks in advance. The law has been criticized for that reason because it baked in a kind of patriarchal assumption that men can't control themselves when their wives quote-unquote betray them. Modern courts have narrowed the doctrine, but it still exists, and it's exactly what John Formisano's defense was trying to invoke. The prosecution's argument was much simpler. It was, look at the evidence. Look at the phone call before he showed up. Look at the false 911 call after. Look at the flight to Livingston. Look at the gun in the trunk. Look at the way he hunted her 2 houses down the block while she was bleeding. Does any of this look like a blackout? The trial happened in 2022, 3 years after the murder. Morris County Superior Court. Judge Michael Gauss presiding. Tim Simonson, the boyfriend who'd survived, testified. Walking into that courtroom 3 years after being shot multiple times, sitting on a stand, and looking the man who shot you in the eye, that's a level of courage I cannot imagine. Tim told the jury what had happened. He described the phone call. He described the flashlight. He described what John Formisano looked like when he came up the stairs. He didn't add drama. He didn't have to. Tim had been through years of recovery by the time he testified. Multiple surgeries, physical therapy. He'd lost time at work. He'd lost a year and change of his life to a man he barely knew. And the most haunting part of his testimony, the part that hit jurors hardest, was when prosecutors asked him to describe the moment John Formisano walked into the master bedroom. Tim said something simple. He said he saw a man in a police uniform. He said his first instinct was that the police had arrived to help. Then he realized who it was. That single beat, relief into terror. That's the thing I keep coming back to in this case. Christy's family had been telling people for years that John was scary. Most of them didn't believe it. He was a cop. He was on the good guys' team. He showed up at family gatherings and held court like a normal man. Tim Simonson had never met him in person before that night. The first time Tim Simonson laid eyes on John Formisano was when John came through the bedroom door with a gun in his hand. And Tim's body did what most people's bodies do when a uniformed police officer enters a room. It relaxed for a half a second. And in that half second, John raised his weapon. The prosecutor used Tim's testimony to anchor the rest of the case. Because if the jury believed Tim, and they did, then the blackout defense was finished. A man who can ring his ex-wife to ask who she's with, drive an hour to her house, do a slow drive-by, park, walk up with a flashlight, use a key, come up the stairs, and confront her boyfriend is not a man who blacks out. He is a man who executes a plan. The defense did their job. They cross-examined Tim. They tried to suggest that Christy had been pulling John back into her life. They tried to suggest that the relationship had been more on and off than the prosecution claimed. None of it landed. Tim was a calm witness. He didn't editorialize. He just kept saying what had happened. The prosecutors also brought in cell phone records, the 911 call recording, neighbor testimony, crime scene photos, and the forensic ballistics. The ballistics matched the service weapon recovered from the trunk of the car John was driving when he was arrested. The bullets that killed Christy came from John Formisano's gun. The bullets that wounded Tim Simonson came from John Formisano's gun. Nobody else's. There was no second shooter argument available. The jury deliberated. On October 3, 2022, they came back with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, first-degree attempted murder, possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose, endangering the welfare of children, official misconduct, hindering apprehension. The whole list. Every count the prosecution had brought. Jurors interviewed after said the evidence had been overwhelming. The bigger question, one juror said, was not whether John Formisano had done it. The bigger question was whether the defense had given them any legal reason to vote for a lesser charge. They couldn't find one. The defense said they would appeal. They always do. As of the time I'm putting this video together, the appeals are still working their way through the New Jersey court system. They almost never succeed in cases this clean. Sentencing happened on December 19, 2022, about 2 months after the verdict. The courtroom was packed. Christy's family was there. Mike, Debbie, Dale. So were Christy's friends from the Morris School District. So were the police officers who'd worked the case. So was Tim Simonson, the surviving boyfriend, who'd come back to the courtroom even though, legally, he didn't have to. Christy's mom, Debbie, gave a victim impact statement. Her stepfather, Dale, gave one. They were short. They were dignified. They didn't shout. They didn't cry. They asked the judge for the maximum sentence. They read letters they had written to Rachel and Ryan and to the memory of their daughter. Then John Formisano got his turn to speak. I want to walk you through what he said, because in some ways it's the worst part of this whole story. It's the part that, if you ever want to know what a man looks like at the end of a road like this is what he looks like. He didn't apologize. Not really. He spent the time attacking prosecutors, insulting the system, calling himself the victim. He talked about his disagreements with the evidence. He talked about how his trial had been unfair. He talked about himself, about his pain, about his suffering. He said, and this is in the court record, "I'm sorry that it happened, but..." That's the line. "I'm sorry that it happened, but..." He couldn't even let the apology finish. He had to qualify it. He had to make it about him. Then he turned to the judge. He looked at the bench, and he told Judge Gauss to give the family, quote, "a Christmas present, give them the maximum sentence." He thought that line was clever. He thought in his head that he was being sarcastic. He thought he was getting one over on the prosecutor. Judge Gauss is on the record responding to that. He looked at John Formisano and said, "I just listened to what may be one of the most narcissistic statements from a defendant that anyone will ever hear in a courtroom." Then the judge dropped the sentence. 79 years in New Jersey State Prison, with parole eligibility after about 55 years. John Formisano was 52 years old at the time of sentencing. The math is not subtle. He would be eligible for parole in his 107th year of life. He is, for any practical purpose, going to die in prison. The judge also ordered him to pay restitution to the New Jersey Victims of Crimes Compensation Office, to reimburse Tim Simonson for medical expenses, to have no contact with Tim Simonson, and to have no contact with his own children or their guardian for a minimum of 180 days, which gave the family at least a window of breathing room. When the judge said the no contact order, John Formisano erupted. He started yelling. He'd been smug a minute before. Now he was furious. He'd just been told that his own kids, Rachel and Ryan, who he'd terrified in their own bedrooms while killing their mother, were going to be legally protected from him. He's the reason the children needed the order, and he was somehow surprised by it. Now, I want to spend a minute on the question that I think runs through all of these cases I've been doing lately, because I don't think there's a clean answer to it, and I don't want to pretend there is. How does a Newark police lieutenant, a 24-year veteran, a man who has supervised other cops, a man who has been in domestic violence calls 1,000 times in his career and seen exactly what these scenes look like, how does that man become the man on the front porch? He knew the playbook. He'd written reports on guys exactly like himself. He'd shown up at homes in his uniform and walked grieving family members through the next steps. He'd talked to widows. He'd been the calm voice in the chaos. And then, on a Sunday night, he was the chaos. I don't have a tidy answer. I don't think anybody does. What the prosecutors at trial argued is the simplest version of it. That John Formisano was a controlling man whose control was slipping. That his wife had moved on. That his self-image as the head of the household couldn't survive contact with the reality that the head of the household didn't live there anymore. And that he made the decision, somewhere along the drive from Newark to Jefferson on July 14th, that if he couldn't have his old life back, nobody else was going to enjoy it either. There's a phrase that researchers use for this specific pattern. They call it intimate partner homicide, preceded by separation. The risk for a woman in an abusive marriage is highest statistically in the months after she leaves, not before, after. The pattern is so consistent that domestic violence professionals teach it as the single most important data point in their field. A woman trying to leave an abusive partner is in more danger than a woman who stays. Not because leaving is wrong. Leaving is the right call. The danger comes from the partner who experiences the loss of control as a kind of psychic injury, and who is willing to do extreme things to undo it. Christy was, by every metric, in that window of greatest danger. She had filed for divorce. She was dating someone new. She was living in the house with the kids. She was holding the line. And the man on the other side of that line was a cop with a gun and a badge and a job that gave him cover. I'm not saying every cop who goes through a divorce is dangerous. I am saying that the warning signs in this case were present for months, and the system around John Formisano did not catch them. Or if it caught them, it did nothing about them. There's no record of an internal affairs investigation before the murder. There's no record of Newark PD pulling his service weapon and ordering a fitness for duty evaluation. There's no record of his supervisor sitting him down for a conversation. The badge stayed on. The gun stayed on. The shifts kept happening. And on a Sunday night, the gun went home with him. Christie's family doesn't talk about the why much in public. I think they've made peace with the fact that there isn't a clean explanation. They talk about Christie, about her kids, about what kind of mother she was. They've kept the focus where it should have been all along, on the person who can't speak for herself anymore. I want to end this with one image, and then we're done. The morning of July 15th, 2019, somebody on Mirror Place in Jefferson Township had to wash that front porch. The neighbors at 5 Mirror Place, whose door Christie had been trying to reach. Somebody had to come back to that porch and clean it, because life has to keep happening on a quiet New Jersey street, even after a thing like this. Mail still has to be delivered. Kids still have to walk to the bus stop. I don't know who did that cleaning. I hope it wasn't her family. I hope it was a stranger or a service, somebody who'd never met Christie, because the people who knew her had to do something else that day. They had to start figuring out how to tell Rachel and Ryan that their mom wasn't coming home. Rachel and Ryan are older now. They're teenagers. They live with Uncle Mike. They're going to school, growing up, doing the things kids do. They have therapy. They have family. They have a community that wraps around them every July, around the anniversary of the worst day of their lives. They have memories of their mom, coffee in one hand, snacks in the other, Christmas decorations going up too early, dance recitals filmed on a phone with shaky hands. They have those. Nobody can take those. And they have one more thing. They have a fact in their heads about what happened that Sunday night. They have whatever pieces their 8-year-old and 9-year-old brains were able to retain. Therapists will work with them on that. Years of work. The brain is good at protecting itself. The brain is also imperfect at protecting itself. Some nights the door downstairs is going to sound exactly like a Sunday night in July. Some nights, a footstep on a staircase is going to be a memory and not a real footstep. That's the inheritance their father left them. He gave a victim impact statement of his own in 2022, sort of, before the judge handed down the sentence. He spent the time attacking prosecutors, insulting the system, calling himself the victim. He never asked his kids to forgive him. He never said their names from the stand. He never said the words, "I love my children," the way most defendants reach for. He had been their father for a decade, and that was the line he could not bring himself to cross. Christie's mother named her children Rachel and Ryan in the courtroom. She said their names so the judge would hear them. She said them so the record would have them. She said them because Rachel and Ryan deserved to be named in the room where the man who took their mother was sentenced. That was the only voice they had that day. Their grandmother said their names. Their father didn't. If anything about this case stayed with you, Tim Simonson getting up on a witness stand and looking the man who shot him in the eye, or Debbie Wagner reading a letter to a daughter who couldn't hear it, or Mike Solaro becoming, in one Sunday night, the legal guardian of his sister's 2 kids, or Miko Velez, the retired cop who set up that fund for the children, leave a comment with what hit you. 3 cases, 3 men who understood law enforcement from the inside, and used that understanding to do harm and avoid accountability. Cannon knew what a crime scene looked like. He sat in the house anyway. Koberger studied why criminals get caught. He still left his DNA at the scene. Formisano placed a false 911 call with the training of a 24-year veteran. He still got caught in 2 hours. The thing none of them counted on was that the people around them, a teenage boy on the phone, a surviving roommate who made a description, a neighbor who heard 3 shots, would be the ones to break each case open. Not the training, not the expertise, just people paying attention. One question for the comments. Do you think the fact that these guys were in law enforcement, or studying it, made them more dangerous? Or does the uniform not actually matter when it comes to this kind of violence? I genuinely want to know what you think. Subscribe if you haven't. New cases every week. See you in the next one.